Welcome to Japan True Stories. Tonight, a quiet story from Japan. Settle in. Voices from Japan, remembering their time in America. These are not judgments. Just what they noticed, living far from home. Settle in. Somewhere in the slow winter of an ordinary year, a person sat down at a low table and wrote out something that many people had quietly wondered about for a long time, but few had taken the trouble to say plainly and without embellishment. Not the America of films or music videos, not the gleaming towers and the wide suburban lawns and the particular sense, carried across oceans by decades of exported entertainment, that everything was available to anyone who wanted it badly enough. This was about a different kind of America, the one most of its people actually lived in. Lived in, walked through, worked within, eaten in, rented a small room inside for a full and ordinary year. That was the America this writer had come to know, and the knowing had shifted something in the way they saw the world. And so, in the manner of all stories that begin not with drama but with a simple and honest observation, this one starts at a low table in the late evening, with a cup of tea placed beside a handwritten page, and a person writing slowly. Soft lamplight. A rain-streaked window. The sound of the city several floors below. The kind of quiet in which a long thought can finally find its way into words. The writer had spent a year in Seattle, a city that held a solid reputation by American standards, associated with coffee and gray, mild weather, and a skyline that faced the water, a place near the top of most assessments of livable American cities. By Japanese standards, they observed with careful thought, Seattle felt most comparable to Sendai, a solid and functional city, decent in all the right ways, a place where a person could live well and find what they needed, but not what came to mind when someone closed their eyes and pictured America. The gap between the imagined version and the one a person actually inhabited was, they came to understand, the entire subject of what they wanted to say, and a full year of living there had been necessary before the gap was clear enough to begin to describe. The first thing that struck them, thinking about it honestly, was the matter of wages and costs moving together, the way that the high salaries, which sounded so remarkable when heard about from a distance, were absorbed almost completely by an equally elevated cost of everything a person needed each day. Rent in a city like Seattle occupied a portion of a monthly salary that would have alarmed most Japanese workers, and it climbed each year without ceremony, and the landlord was under no particular obligation to ask whether this was convenient for the person sleeping in the apartment. The writer observed that an ordinary salaryman in Japan, someone who commuted on a crowded train, attended department meetings, ate a convenience store lunch at their desk, and saved a modest amount each month, would be, in the American context, something closer to a precarious contract worker, without the slow accumulation of security that the Japanese employment structure, for all of its frustrations, quietly provided. The stable, sufficient life that a middle-income position in Japan could sustain over many years would require, in America, either exceptional talent developed and cultivated over a long time, or a run of good fortune that most people in most countries could not count on in advance. At the very top, the rewards were real and large, and the writer acknowledged them honestly. Those who had combined intelligence with effort and the grace of good timing in a fast-moving field could accumulate wealth on a scale that had no real equivalent in Japan, and that openness to extraordinary individual rise was a genuine and important thing about the country. But below that upper world, the drop was steeper than the image suggested, and the line between a comfortable life and one lived with persistent financial anxiety was thinner than people imagined, and what most often caused a person to cross it was not failure of character or effort but a single medical event arriving without warning. The writer mentioned the appendix, that quiet internal organ that most people never think about until it becomes a sudden emergency, and said that a single surgery of that kind, without adequate insurance coverage, could consume in the space of a few hours the savings of several careful years. They noted that even a dental cavity, the kind of small, routine inconvenience that a Japanese person might address on a lunch break at a clinic around the corner for a modest fee, and then forget about entirely by evening, could, in America without the right coverage, become the beginning of a financial difficulty that lasted far longer than the toothache itself. There was no national health system, and the absence of one arranged itself through daily life in ways that were not always obvious to a visitor but became visible, gradually and cumulatively, to someone who stayed long enough to see the patterns that lay beneath the surface. The gym photographs that filled social media feeds, the carefully lit images of Americans running along waterfronts, lifting weights in bright studios, posting their active mornings to audiences of followers, were, the writer came slowly to understand, not simply the performance of wellness or the seeking of attention. They were, at least in part, a response to the quiet knowledge that a doctor was expensive and sometimes unreachable without a particular kind of employment, and that keeping the body strong was therefore not a lifestyle preference but a form of practical self-protection, a daily act carried out in lieu of the institutional safety net that was elsewhere. And the clubs and the bars and the large, sociable gatherings that seemed to be such a constant feature of American social life, these, too, were not simply extroversion, not purely a national temperament expressing itself, but also the natural result of living in a country where solitary entertainment was expensive and thin, and going somewhere with others was, by comparison, the option that cost the least. The food trucks that lined American office streets were worth some attention, the writer felt, because from the outside they looked cheerful and inventive, bright mobile kitchens with chalkboard menus, queues of professionals in good coats, a sense of urban creativity and independent spirit. The reason for them was more practical than picturesque. Restaurants were expensive enough that eating out for a midday meal was not something most office workers could do regularly without consequence, and there were no convenience stores of the Japanese kind, no places where a person might gather a warm rice ball, a small soup, and a coffee in under 3 minutes and be back at their desk before the next meeting. In Japan, the writer reflected, the density of these small food options had become so complete that it was invisible. The konbini, those convenience stores, on every other block, with their fresh foods and rotating seasonal menus, the standing noodle counters that served a warm bowl in 8 minutes, the vending machines dispensing hot drinks in winter, all of it so reliably present that it had ceased to be experienced as remarkable. In America, that particular texture was absent, and feeding oneself well during a working week required a degree of planning and driving and advance arrangement that added a layer of daily friction that the writer had never once noticed when those same hours had been spent in Japan. The cars told a version of the same story, and the writer spent some time here because the image of Americans and their automobiles had always looked like a preference freely chosen, a people who had selected the open highway over the crowded train, who had a genuine and abiding romance with the road. Having lived among it, they came to understand that the choice was considerably more constrained than it appeared, that in most American cities public transport was minimal or unreliable, and that without a car a person could not reach their job, their grocery store, or their doctor in any way compatible with the actual hours of a working life. They noted that even highway rest stops, which in Japan offered regional specialty foods, local crafts, clean facilities, and a gentle sense of the particular character of wherever a traveler happened to be pausing, were largely absent from the American road, replaced in their function by the one establishment present at exits across the entire length and breadth of the country. McDonald's was not simply a fast food chain in the American context but something closer to infrastructure, present wherever a tired driver needed a bathroom or a warm meal, as consistent and geographically reliable as the roads themselves, from the coasts to the deepest interior of the continent. The 7-Eleven, which in Japan had become a small marvel of the quotidian, warm prepared foods changed throughout the day, fresh sushi at a modest price, seasonal menus that shifted with the months, a pharmacy corner, a general atmosphere of having been more carefully considered than its size required, was, in its American original, something more modest in its ambitions. The American 7-Eleven was a gas station corner shop, with a smaller selection and fewer prepared foods and none of the studied seasonal thoughtfulness, and this small difference seemed emblematic of something larger. Two countries that had imagined small daily convenience differently, had built different things around it, and had produced different textures of daily life as a result. The sharehouses made complete sense in this light, the reason so many American adults, people well past the age at which a Japanese person might expect to have their own apartment, lived with housemates was not communal philosophy but simple arithmetic, rents in the cities where work was available having climbed to levels that a single income could rarely support comfortably. And the group activities, the deliberate cultivation of social gatherings, the house parties and the weekend plans and the careful maintenance of friendships, were not purely extroversion but also a practical adaptation, because in a country where going out alone was expensive and thin in its options, going somewhere with others was simply what made most sense. University campuses came up in this part of the writer's reflections, and they noted that American colleges often functioned as self-enclosed worlds, small cities within cities, with their own dining and entertainment and social infrastructure built so deeply into the architecture that it could seem like these places had been designed to be complete in themselves. For students in many parts of the country, the campus was surrounded by distances that required a car to cross, and the world outside the gates offered relatively little that was affordable and nearby on a student's time and money, and so the campus had evolved over generations to fill the space the surrounding landscape had left empty. Sports had become the shared entertainment not because Americans had arrived at this preference freely but because it fit the space available, the enormous stadiums and the devoted crowds and the intricate machinery of collegiate athletics were built, at least in part, on the simple foundation of there not being much else to gather around in quite the same way. Employment was arranged on principles that required adjustment to understand, and the writer spent careful time on this, because they had grown up in a system where the relationship between a worker and an employer carried an implied permanence they had never once registered as a feature until they saw what life looked like without it. In America, a senior employee, someone who had spent decades with a company, had built relationships, trained younger colleagues, and carried an institutional memory that went back many years, could be released, without much ceremony, at the decision of someone above them, for reasons that were not required to be gradual or particularly explained. The writer recalled hearing of people hired on a Monday who were gone before the following Friday, not through any fault of their own but because economic conditions had shifted between one week and the next, because a financial disruption had arrived without announcing itself in advance, because circumstances somewhere had changed color. For those without the particular intelligence or educational background that placed a person in the tier that made such decisions rather than received them, the most reliable path to a stable life was the military, which offered structure, healthcare, and the certainty of continued employment that the private sector, across much of the economy, simply could not guarantee. In Japan, they reflected, the structure was slower and more conservative and frustrated ambitious people in its own ways, but it also rarely left a working person without a flaw entirely, and the flaw, having been absent for a year, now seemed more valuable than it had when they had stood on it every day without giving it a single thought. The house parties, seen in this light, made an emotional sense that had not been immediately obvious. The careful cultivation of social networks was, among other things, a form of distributed insurance, a hedge against the moment when institutional support was unavailable and a person needed to draw on other people rather than on systems. The writer turned, in the later portion of their reflections, to the question of the image, why the gap between how America appeared and how it was for most of its people was so persistent and so wide, and offered an answer that was simple but worth saying slowly. The stories that had traveled farthest, the films and the television series and the cultural output that had shaped how people around the world understood American life, came almost exclusively from the comfortable upper portion of the economic distribution, from a world of professional ease and photogenic prosperity that represented a relatively small fraction of the actual country. What reached Japan, and Europe, and everywhere else, was a portrait of perhaps the top fifth, and behind that portrait was a wider and quieter and more ordinary America, people working hard and managing and adapting and sometimes struggling considerably, and the portrait had very little room in it for all of that. The writer acknowledged the genuine pleasures without reluctance, because they were not the kind of person who found a one-sided account satisfying, and because fairness, in their view, was simply part of honesty. They mentioned the informality, the ease with which strangers began conversations, the sense that formality was not required as a condition of basic respect, the particular American directness that was startling at first and became, over time, something one came to appreciate for its efficiency and its absence of hidden layers. They noted that eating out in America felt like an occasion in a way it rarely did in Japan, because it was expensive enough to remain, for most families, something done a few times a year rather than a casual weekday habit, and the pleasure people took in it was genuine and unconcealed and, the writer found, a little touching to observe from nearby. They remembered seeing a family at an ordinary chain restaurant eating with the kind of open, uncomplicated delight that seemed unusual to Japanese eyes, and then understanding that for this family the meal was a small celebration, a thing planned for over several weeks, and that the happiness was therefore proportional to the anticipation, and entirely honest in its way. Toward the end, the writer turned to Japan itself, quietly and without announcement, with the careful attention of someone who had been away long enough to see a familiar place with restored detail, the way a well-known face reveals itself differently after a period of absence. Japan had its own difficulties, and the writer did not pretend otherwise: the working hours that extended too far, the wages that had not kept pace with what one hoped, the political arrangements that changed less readily than a democratic system perhaps should, the various ways the country asked its people to absorb inconveniences quietly. But the convenience store on the corner, the one with the rotating seasonal offerings and the warm prepared foods and the clean bathroom and the courteous person behind the counter who bowed when a customer left, was not, seen from the outside of it, a small or unremarkable thing. The train, arriving within seconds of the time printed on the board, had always been slightly miraculous to visitors and entirely invisible to residents, the way all reliable things become invisible when they have never once failed, and there is therefore no moment in which their presence is registered as something that could have been otherwise. The health card, the dentist a short ride away, the affordable prescription, the system that meant a toothache was an inconvenience rather than a financial event, these things, regarded now from the outside of them, revealed themselves as the product of choices made over generations about what a society should offer its people in the ordinary course of a day. Those choices were not inevitable, the writer came to feel, and they were not universal, and they deserved, perhaps, a moment of quiet recognition before the morning train arrived and the day resumed and all of it went invisible once again in the way of things that have always been there. The writer set down what they had written, and the evening continued around them in the way evenings do when a thought has been followed all the way through, not brighter or darker than before, but somehow more settled, the way water settles after it has been briefly disturbed and then left in peace. Both places had their difficulties, both had their moments of unexpected grace, and the world was neither as good as its most flattering stories nor quite as hard as its worst ones, and a person could live meaningfully in either place if they understood clearly what was being offered and what, honestly, was not. The comparison had done what honest comparisons do at their best, not delivered a verdict, but loosened the invisible certainties that accumulate around whatever life one has always lived, until those certainties can be examined in a different light and set down again in a slightly different arrangement. Somewhere, a kettle reached its temperature and a person poured water into a small cup, and for a moment the steam rose in the lamplight and the room smelled of warmth, and nothing was decided and nothing needed to be. That, perhaps, was enough for this evening, the sufficiency of it, the small warmth, the way an ordinary moment of comfort can hold everything that needs holding without asking to be called anything more than what it simply and quietly is. And that is where we leave this story for tonight, not with a conclusion, because the lives inside it are still ongoing and the questions they raised are still in motion, but with a softness, the kind that settles when a thought has been thought all the way through to wherever it wanted to go, and then, gently, released. And so we leave that hallway behind, let it drift back into the quiet dark where it belongs. There is no hurry here. If you need to settle a little deeper into your pillow, to let your shoulders fall just a little heavier, please do. Take one slow breath with me now, in and out. The night is long, and we have nowhere else to be. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, a small apartment at the edge of a city, where the rain has just begun to tap against a window pane, and someone is sitting alone with a cup of tea, remembering something they had almost forgotten. Let the sound of that rain find you, gently, as we begin. Somewhere in the middle of the last century, in the soft and ordinary hours of an American evening, a small and humble invention made its way into millions of homes, arriving not with any announcement, but simply by being useful. It was a meal in a tray, a single aluminum tray, neatly divided into sections, each holding something different, sealed beneath a thin sheet of foil and waiting, quietly and without complaint, in the cold of a freezer until the moment it was needed. Such a meal was known, simply and cheerfully, as a television dinner, and the name alone carried something warm and uncomplicated, something that asked very little of the person holding it and gave back, in its modest way, a kind of comfort. These meals were simple in their arrangement, a portion of meat on one side of the tray, potatoes soft and yielding in another compartment, vegetables tucked neatly into a third, everything organized and self-contained and asking nothing of the eater beyond the willingness to sit down. Sometimes the meat was beef, sometimes chicken, and sometimes it was turkey, sliced thin and laid beneath a gravy that, even arriving from a cardboard box, managed to carry something that felt warm and familiar, something that recalled an unhurried kitchen and patient hands. Pause? The preparation asked almost nothing of the cook, if that word could even be applied fairly here. The box was opened, the tray was placed in the oven or, later, in the microwave, and the meal simply became, without effort or skill, needing only a little heat and a little time. For the people who arrived home in the particular kind of exhaustion that leaves the hands too heavy for a pot or a chopping board, the television dinner was an act of quiet mercy, a small kindness sitting in the freezer, ready for whenever it was most needed. One woman, speaking of the brand called Hungry Man, a name that made its promise with the directness of a handshake, mentioned that she cooked regularly, genuinely enjoyed cooking, but there were evenings when the day had used up everything she had, and on those evenings, the frozen turkey dinner sitting in her freezer was precisely what she needed, and she received it without any pretense of apology. There was something honest in this, just the quiet gratitude of someone who had been given a few more minutes of stillness at the end of a long day, and knew it, and was glad. Pause? Children found in these trays a particular and uncomplicated happiness, the kind that comes from food that makes no demands, that is simply warm and already sorted into its pieces when it arrives, requiring nothing from the child but a fork and an appetite. There is a scene from a well-loved American film of the early 1990s in which a boy left alone in his family's large house makes his way through a supermarket, choosing what he wants with the deliberate pleasure of someone who has never before been allowed to make such choices entirely on his own. Among the things he chose was a frozen macaroni and cheese dinner, which he prepared in the microwave and ate with the satisfaction of someone who had managed a small and important thing, and the film paused on this moment in a way that felt genuinely fond of both the boy and his modest meal. He observed, in the manner of a child who has just discovered a private competence, that the frozen macaroni and cheese dinner was nutritious and fully satisfying, and expressed additional gratitude for the fact that it happened to be on sale, as though the universe itself had decided to cooperate with his small domestic independence. Breadth? The variety within the world of the television dinner was, in its own understated way, a kind of abundance: hamburger steak, meatloaf slow and yielding in its own juices, fried chicken in its battered coat, nuggets in various shapes, dishes that owed something to Italian cooking and something to Chinese-American cooking and something to the broad, accommodating appetite of the American heartland. There were pasta dishes of different kinds, and stews of various meats, and one could find, if one looked along the right section of the frozen food aisle, almost any version of what Americans understood a dinner to be, waiting in its box with the patient availability of something designed entirely around convenience. Desserts were included too, in the smallest compartment at one corner of the tray: chocolate brownies most often, or fruit tarts, or a small portion of apple compote, a gesture toward sweetness that completed the meal's intentions, whether or not it always succeeded in fully delivering them. The brownie, in particular, occupied a special and somewhat tender place in the television dinner's long story, not because it was excellent, but because it was so reliably, so faithfully, so endearingly imperfect, and because everyone who had eaten one seemed to know exactly what to expect and found themselves returning anyway. Pause? Cooked at the same temperature and for the same duration as the meat and the potatoes and the vegetables, the brownie faced a structural disadvantage that it never quite overcame, emerging either still cool at its center, or dried to something that bore only a distant resemblance to the soft, dark square depicted on the packaging. The distance between the image on the box and the actual brownie in the tray became, across the decades, a kind of shared understanding between people who had grown up eating these meals, recognized, accepted, and carried forward with something closer to affection than disappointment. Someone once observed, with the mild and patient frustration of a person who has thought about this at greater length than was perhaps strictly necessary, that humanity was already planning voyages to distant planets while still having not resolved the more immediate question of how to cook a brownie and a piece of chicken at the same temperature and have both emerge in an acceptable condition. Breadth? The solution that passed from person to person, in the quiet way that useful knowledge travels without any official channel, was to remove the brownie partway through the heating process, set it aside on the counter, and allow the warmth already gathered within it to finish what the microwave had started, a small and practical workaround that, for reasons no one entirely understood, seemed to make the brownie taste better for having required that additional patience. The flavor of the television dinner, overall, was something people spoke of with an honest gentleness, salty, on balance, with textures that leaned toward softness, the hamburger a little yielding, the fried chicken's coating inclined to separate from the meat beneath it, the pasta occasionally more fragile than pasta has any reason to be. Pause? Freezing is not particularly kind to flavor, and the people who made these meals understood this, compensating with salt and with sauces sturdy enough to survive the journey through cold and heat without losing all of their character, a reasonable and entirely honest compromise between what food can be and what it needs to become in order to endure. And yet, and this is the thing the story keeps returning to, quietly, whenever it is told, people loved them anyway. Not despite the imperfections, but alongside them, woven through all the other small associations that had gathered around these meals over the years, the sound of the television in the next room, the particular comfort of an evening with nowhere to be, the feeling of something warm and already done appearing at exactly the moment it was most wanted. Long pause? One person, looking through old photographs on a phone late at night, came across an image of an empty Hungry Man box taken years earlier in a college apartment, and found they had no clear memory of why it had been photographed, only that it had seemed worth keeping at the time, and that looking at it again felt like finding something familiar in an unexpected drawer. Another person remembered a mother who was by any measure a genuinely talented cook, who made handmade dinners nearly every evening with care and evident pleasure, and yet the family still asked for television dinners on certain evenings, not because the homemade food was lacking, but because the frozen dinner occupied its own entirely separate register, one associated with ease and comfort and the looseness of a night without obligations. Pause. The history of the television dinner begins in the state of Nebraska, in the year 1953, with a company called Swanson, which had been producing frozen foods for several years and found itself, in the autumn of 1952, in possession of a logistical difficulty of some proportion. The company had prepared far more frozen turkey than the market had required that season, 260 tons, which is a quantity that exceeds any reasonable expectation, and the surplus birds were moving slowly in refrigerated railway cars across the country, waiting while the company considered what might be done with all of them. The solution that emerged drew its inspiration from an unexpected source: the meal trays served to passengers on airplanes in those years, each food in its own small compartment, nothing touching anything else, the whole arrangement communicating that a complete dinner could be organized with precision and delivered without requiring any effort from the person receiving it. Breath? The idea took shape around the surplus turkey. It would be sliced and paired with mashed potatoes and peas and a small, sweet portion of stuffing, arranged in a divided aluminum tray, sealed, frozen, and offered as something genuinely new, a complete dinner requiring only the heat of a kitchen oven and 25 minutes of patient waiting. In those years, the microwave was not yet common in American homes, and so the tray was made of aluminum, which withstood the dry heat of an oven without complaint, and the meal that emerged, turkey with gravy, 2 vegetables, potatoes, was modest and filling and, as it turned out, reasonably nourishing for a single serving. On the 10th of September in the year 1953, the Swanson television dinner appeared on store shelves for the first time, priced at 98 cents, a sum that, measured against the prices of later decades, would translate to something close to $11, which was fair for a meal that arrived already assembled and asked nothing more of the buyer than a working oven and a little time. Pause? The packaging was designed to communicate something new and quietly exciting. A picture of a television set occupied the face of the box, because in those years television was itself still associated with novelty and possibility, and linking a meal to that feeling was a way of suggesting that the dinner shared in something of television's particular modernity. The marketing images of those early years showed families gathered at a table with pleased and expectant expressions as the meal emerged from the oven, or a woman in a neat coat lifting a bag of frozen dinners with the composed satisfaction of someone who has arranged her evening efficiently, and these images communicated, in their own earnest way, something genuinely aspirational about the convenience these meals represented. Within a single year of its introduction, 10 million trays had been sold, a number large enough to suggest that the product had touched something real in the rhythm of American domestic life, settling into households not as a novelty but as a quiet and dependable presence. Pause? The menu grew steadily from those first turkey trays. Hamburger steak was added, and fried chicken, and as time passed the tray gained a 4th compartment, making room for cranberry sauce or a small dessert, and the range of available meals widened to include something for nearly every version of dinner that Americans recognized and wanted. Turkey remained always available, the founding protein of the whole enterprise, but around it gathered many others, each in its foil-covered tray, each waiting in the refrigerated aisle of a supermarket for someone who needed dinner and needed it without ceremony or preparation or anything beyond a willingness to open a box. In 1987, more than 30 years after the first television dinner had appeared on store shelves, an aluminum meal tray was accepted into the permanent collection of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, placed among the objects that the country had decided were worth preserving as evidence of how ordinary life had actually been lived, what had been eaten, what had made an evening feel manageable and whole. Breath? a humble tray, made to be used once and discarded, kept instead as a record of something that had mattered without intending to, that had become part of the texture of daily life without any ambition beyond the practical, and had accumulated along the way a meaning that no one had originally planned for it. The brands that came after Swanson each found their own place in the long refrigerated corridor of the frozen food aisle: Hungry Man for those who needed more than a standard portion could provide, Banquet for the breadth of its options, Swedish meatballs, cheesy rice, small pepperoni pizzas, a range that made the aisle feel, in its way, like a neighborhood of different kitchens compressed into one long, orderly row of boxes. Pause? And then the children's version, a line of meals designed with younger eaters in mind, with corn substituted for the mixed vegetables that children had historically declined with such consistency that someone at the company had clearly taken note, and with small additions that made the meal feel like something chosen rather than assigned: chicken shaped like dinosaurs, a chocolate sauce for dipping, a cookie that left the tongue an unlikely shade of blue. These details were remembered, years later, by the adults who had once eaten them, not because the food itself had been remarkable, but because it had been theirs, connected to specific evenings on specific sofas in front of specific television programs. And memory is not always proportional to quality, but it is very often proportional to warmth. One person mentioned, with a gravity that was fond rather than solemn, that even in the most extreme imaginable circumstances, the last meal they would choose would be from the children's frozen dinner line, and this was not a statement about hardship, but a tribute, an acknowledgement that some things stay with a person in ways that no reasonable accounting would predict. Pause? A father recalled that on evenings when he was alone with his children and dinner needed no occasion, he would prepare the children's version of the frozen meal and they would eat together on the sofa while a race played on the television, and this description of an evening was small and complete and needed nothing added to it to be understood as something good. The frozen food aisles of American supermarkets, lined with boxes and trays arranged in long and orderly rows, were sometimes compared to a library, the same sense of organized variety waiting quietly for whoever happened to need it, the same patient readiness along a corridor of choices. Someone noted, too, that there was something resembling the bento section of a Japanese supermarket in the logic of it all, the same understanding that people needed to eat and did not always have time or energy to prepare food entirely from nothing, the same arrangement of complete meals in neat rows, waiting with the same unhurried availability for whoever came along at the end of a long day. Breath? And the image of a wide sofa in a warm room, a television playing something undemanding in the soft light of an ordinary evening, a tray of food balanced on a knee. This was not elegant, and was not trying to be, but it was genuinely honest about what an evening after a long day often felt like, and honesty has its own kind of comfort that elegance cannot quite replicate. The television dinner made no promises it could not keep, it did not suggest it would transform a meal into an occasion, did not offer more than it was, and this modesty was perhaps the deepest part of its lasting appeal, the quality that allowed people to feel warmly toward it across decades without ever needing to overlook any pretension. The brownie would always be a little difficult, the chicken's coating would come loose, the pasta would sometimes break before it should, and all of this was known, unexpected, and perhaps even appreciated for the way it made the meal feel like an old acquaintance, familiar, unchanged, reliably itself across all the years one had known it. Pause? In Nebraska, in the autumn of 1952, a practical and quietly creative mind looked at 260 tons of frozen turkey and decided to do something thoughtful with the difficulty, and the thing that came from that decision found its way into millions of kitchens and millions of evenings across the following decades, gathering along the way all the small memories and associations that turn an ordinary object into something warmer than itself. It is a quiet kind of contribution to the world, not the kind that receives ceremony or appears in histories written for posterity, but the kind that shows up in the back of a freezer on a difficult Tuesday evening and asks for nothing more than to be useful, and is, and leaves without making anything of it. And in the long and gentle accounting of things that mattered without quite knowing they mattered, the brownie that never came out right, the dinosaur-shaped nuggets, the aluminum tray now kept behind glass in a museum case, there is room for all of it, room for the modest and imperfect things that made ordinary evenings a little more bearable, a little more like rest. The tray is long eaten, the evening is long past, and what remains is something warmer and less specific, a feeling that sits somewhere near the word enough, or near the word home, or near the particular piece of an evening that made no demands and offered, in return, a quiet hour of warmth that needed no justification to be real. And that, perhaps, is where this chapter of the story rests, in the soft and ordinary comfort of a meal that was never trying to be anything more than what it was, and was, in its own unassuming way, exactly sufficient. Pause? And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade softly, like a dream you can no longer quite hold. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take it, breathe in slowly, feel the weight of the blanket, the quiet settling around you. You are safe, and still, and there is nowhere else you need to be. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, like a small room, unhurried, where the night is gentle and the hours move like water. When you are ready, simply let yourself drift a little further, and the words will find you there. Somewhere in the warm and ordinary stillness of a late evening, a young woman named Marissa was sitting alone at the low table by her window, turning through the pages of a travel guidebook she had read so many times the spine had softened like old cloth. She had been saving money for some months now, setting aside a little from each paycheck with the patient discipline her mother had always practiced, folding small amounts of hope into the future, one careful month at a time. Her friend Rimu, who had come over for tea and had not quite managed to leave yet, noticed the guidebook across the table and leaned in slightly, asking in a mild voice where on earth Marissa was planning to go this time. Marissa mentioned, with the particular calm of someone who has made up their mind slowly and thoroughly, that she wanted to go to Texas, the state of Texas, in America, and that she was hoping to travel in autumn, when the weather would be more forgiving and the season would have that quality of golden, unhurried light she had been imagining. Her friend had assumed France, she would later admit, or perhaps somewhere in Southeast Asia, somewhere well known for its cooking, since Marissa had always been the kind of person whose travel plans were organized, above all else, around what she intended to eat when she arrived. Texas had not been her first guess, and she said so, but Marissa had a reason, and she explained it with the unhurried pleasure of someone who has been waiting for the right moment to tell a story they have been carrying carefully for a while. In the city of Dallas, every year in October, there was a celebration called the Texas State Fair, a great gathering that ran for nearly a month, filling the autumn with the smells of cooking and the sounds of people who had come from a very long way to be part of something. It was, Marissa observed quietly, not easy to describe in a single phrase, because it was several things at once, part agricultural exhibition, part carnival, part invention fair, and something entirely its own, the kind of event that existed in no other city, in no other season, in no other particular way. Rimu listened, cupping the tea in both hands the way one does when the evening has grown pleasantly cool, and asked what it was, specifically, that had captured Marissa's attention so thoroughly, that had set her to saving money and reading guidebooks and thinking about a place on the other side of the world. The fried food, Marissa told her, quietly and without apology. It was, above everything else, the extraordinary variety of things that vendors at that fair had decided, over the years, to fry. She had been reading about it for months, she admitted, collecting information the careful and thorough way she collected most things, following articles and small films about the fair's most unusual offerings until she felt she almost knew the fairground by heart. the tradition of deep frying in America was not merely a cooking method, she had come to understand, but something closer to a cultural philosophy, a cheerful, unapologetic belief that almost anything, treated with enough heat and enough oil and a little imagination, could become something worth eating and worth sharing. Fried butter was the dish she kept returning to in her reading, the one that had first caught her attention and refused to let it go. Butter wrapped in a shell of batter or breadcrumbs, lowered into hot oil until the outside became crisp and the inside melted into something warm and liquid and richly, generously itself. It had appeared at the Texas State Fair in 4 flavors: plain, cherry, grape, and garlic, and something like 40,000 portions had been sold over the course of that first year, a number that Rimu received with a long, quiet moment of genuine consideration. At a California fair, Marissa mentioned, a later version had been sold alongside chocolate-covered bacon, packaged together under a name that referred, with a certain wry American frankness, to what such a combination might eventually do to one's arteries, a name offered not as a warning but almost as a wink, the vendors entirely aware of their own excess. Rimu found herself thinking that there was a particular kind of honesty in that naming, a willingness to look directly at what you were doing and call it exactly what it was, without softening the edges, which struck her as something very specifically American. Fried ice cream was on the list as well, and this required less explanation, because Japanese restaurants had served tempura ice cream for years, the cold center and the warm crust meeting in each bite in a way that still surprised you even when you were expecting it. The American version, Marissa explained slowly, was placed inside a cheeseburger, the fried ice cream nestled between the bun and the patty and the melted cheese in a combination that was, she admitted, difficult to fully imagine and perhaps best simply tasted. It was not so different, she offered gently, from the general American approach to food, generous, curious, willing to place things next to each other that had not previously been neighbors and see what might come of the arrangement. The funnel cake cheeseburger was another version of this spirit, and perhaps the easier one to picture, a lacy, sweet fried dough, the kind sold at fairgrounds across North America for many generations, used as the bun for a burger patty and a warm slice of cheese. Marissa had tried funnel cake herself, not in Texas but at a small bakery in their neighborhood that had begun selling them after the pastry started appearing in Japanese food magazines, served with powdered sugar and fruit and whipped cream in the careful, elegant way that Japanese cafes have of presenting even the most casual things. The taste, she recalled with the particular warmth of remembering something unexpectedly good, was somewhere between a churro and a donut, crisp on the surface, tender within, sweet in the uncomplicated, open-handed way that good fair food tends to be. Rimu nodded slowly, remembering that she had been to that same bakery once, and had ordered the funnel cake without knowing quite what she was ordering, and had liked it more than she expected, and for a moment they sat together in the quiet pleasure of a shared memory they had not known they shared until just now. Fried cola was the next entry in Marissa's notes, and she was careful to explain it, because the name suggested something that was, in practice, impossible. One cannot fry a liquid, and the reality was something quite different and rather more interesting than the name alone implied. A dough flavored with frozen Coca-Cola syrup was fried until golden and then drizzled with additional syrup, sometimes finished with whipped cream and cinnamon sugar, producing something that tasted, according to those who had eaten it, more like an ordinary donut than one might expect, sweeter, yes, with a brightness that ordinary dough did not carry, but not so different from something already familiar. The dish had been invented in 2006 by a man who worked in computers, which Marissa found a very American combination of occupations, and it had sold some 35,000 servings in the first 24 days it was available, suggesting that people had been waiting for it without quite knowing they were waiting. The inventor had no interest in patenting the recipe, she added, which meant that in theory anyone could make it, that the idea existed freely in the world, available to whoever cared to pick it up and carry it somewhere new. Rimu mentioned, softly, that this seemed a little lonely for an invention, and Marissa agreed, and they sat for a moment with the small, gentle wistfulness of that thought before the conversation moved on of its own accord. The talk drifted, in the way that late evening conversations tend to drift, following one fried thing to the next, without urgency, both of them comfortable in the room and comfortable with each other and in no particular rush to be anywhere else. Fried pizza was where Marissa grew particularly animated, and she introduced it with a small gesture toward the kitchen, because she had, in fact, made some earlier that evening, before Rimu arrived, a quiet experiment she had been meaning to try for weeks. The dish had roots in Italy, she had learned, a tradition of frying pizza dough that predated the Texas State Fair by a considerable stretch, and it had come to wider American attention through the fair's remarkable talent for drawing interest to things that might otherwise remain regional, known only to the places that had invented them. From Texas it had traveled to a Japanese restaurant in New York, where it appeared on the menu as tempura pizza and was received with immediate warmth by customers who found in it something both familiar and slightly new, the way the best borrowed ideas always feel. She had used a supermarket pizza for her experiment, the refrigerated kind, quite ordinary, cutting it into slices and lowering them carefully into oil heated in a deep pan, watching the cheese begin to pull inward just as the outer edge turned to a pale, clean gold. She set a slice on a small plate in front of Rimu without ceremony, the way one offers something comfortable rather than something exotic, and Rimu took a careful first bite and found, after a moment's consideration, that it was simply, quietly, good. The outside had the texture of good tempura, crisp in a way that yielded gently, without any resistance, and the inside was warm and soft, and the cheese had done exactly what cheese does best when it is given a little heat and left alone, and Rimu found herself thinking that this would be entirely at home at an izakaya, the kind of small Japanese pub where food arrives one unhurried dish at a time and the evening extends pleasantly around the table. The fried sandwich came next in Marissa's notes, and it had originated not in Texas but in California's San Joaquin Valley, at a festival organized around asparagus, the region's particular pride, its most celebrated crop, given a full month of pageantry and competition and community each spring. Among the many asparagus preparations that filled the fairground stalls, asparagus ice cream, asparagus burgers, asparagus pasta, a full asparagus cooking competition, there was one stall that offered a sandwich containing no asparagus at all. It was a peanut butter and strawberry jam sandwich, the filling pressed between two slices of bread and the whole sealed in batter and fried until golden, then finished with a dusting of powdered sugar that gave it the look of something caught between a dessert and an afternoon snack. Rimu wondered aloud whether the vendor had made a practical and sympathetic decision, that among so much asparagus, what some people needed was something reliably beloved, something that required no explanation and no adjustment, something that simply tasted like itself, and Marissa thought that this was probably exactly right. Near the end of her notes was alligator, which Marissa introduced with a small pause and a slight smile, having saved it as the entry she had spent the longest time thinking about how to explain. Alligator meat was eaten across the American South, in Florida, in Louisiana, along the warm, slow-moving waterways where alligators lived in unhurried abundance, and the taste was described, by most who had tried it, as mild and lean and not so different from chicken breast, the meat taking on the flavor of whatever it was cooked alongside. Fried alligator at a fairground lost much of what might otherwise seem unusual about it, because deep frying has a particular talent for making things approachable, the golden crust doing the quiet work of familiarity, the heat making everything tender and accessible and less strange than it was before. Marissa had, in what Rimu recognized as an entirely typical piece of thorough follow-through, ordered alligator meat online. It was available, it turned out, through a major shopping site, boneless and frozen, and had fried it at home one afternoon and found it mild and pleasant, a little like chicken thigh, the oil removing whatever wildness the meat might originally have carried. She had eaten it with rice, she mentioned, and Rimu found this deeply unsurprising and somehow comforting, the idea that the most unusual ingredient in the world could still arrive, in the end, served over a bowl of plain white rice in a Tokyo apartment by someone who found that to be the most natural thing. Fried pickles followed in the notes, and these required somewhat less explanation, pickles being a thing both countries knew well, even if the idea of placing them in hot oil still took a brief, adjusting moment. In the American South they were a common thing at bars and casual restaurants, served with a dipping sauce that cut through the salt and the sourness of the pickle, and the combination of that sharpness with the warmth and crunch of the batter produced something that people who had never imagined wanting it tended to find they had, in fact, been wanting without knowing it. There was a restaurant nearby, Marissa mentioned, a chain with American origins that had several branches in Tokyo, that served fried pickles alongside chicken wings, and the reviews mentioned the pickles often enough that she had drawn a small circle around the restaurant's name in her notes. Rimu looked at the circled name and felt the particular small surprise of realizing that something she had walked past without noticing contained, apparently, something worth noticing, a feeling she associated with many of the better discoveries. And then, at the last pages of the notebook, were the fried California rolls, a dish that had traveled so far and been remade so many times that its origins had become a story in themselves, one of those quiet stories that runs beneath a food and gives it a depth most people eating it have no reason to know. California rolls had been created at a small Japanese restaurant in Los Angeles, Marissa explained, as a gentle accommodation for diners who were uncertain about raw fish, a thoughtful translation, an act of welcome made through cooking rather than through words. The rolls crossed the Pacific, settled into menus in Japan, became familiar, and then someone in America had looked at this already traveled dish and asked whether it might also be fried, and the answer, as the answer tends to be in places that treat possibility as an open invitation, was yes, and the result was something new, as these things always are. Rimu found herself thinking, quietly, that there was something generous about all of it, about the persistent human habit of looking at a thing that exists and asking whether it might become something more, or something different, or something that could reach a few more people than it had reached before. Tempura itself was a borrowed thing, she knew, brought to Japan by Portuguese sailors centuries ago, adapted slowly over generations until it was so thoroughly Japanese that its origins had become a footnote rather than a description, the borrowing long since completed and the thing itself simply belonging. Food traveled in ways that people did not always think about, picking up customs and ingredients and techniques as it went, arriving somewhere new and being changed again, and the fried California roll was just the newest step in a process that had been going on for a very long time, before any of them had been born. There was something reassuring in that, Rimu found, in the idea that the world had always been doing this, always been trading and adapting and transforming, and that all the strange and wonderful things on Marissa's list were simply the latest verses in a very old song. Marissa set her notebook aside and looked out at the window, where the city was doing what cities do in the evening, glowing softly behind its own reflections, moving at a pace that asked nothing of anyone, going on with the comfortable indifference of something that has been doing this for a very long time. She still intended to go to Texas, she said, in October, when the fair would be running and the air would have that quality she had been imagining, dry and golden and carrying the smell of cooking from a dozen directions at once, the smell of something always being made. She would eat fried butter if she could, she thought, just once, just to know what it was in the body rather than in the imagination, to have the experience as a thing that had actually happened rather than something she had only ever read about in a warm room very far away. And afterward, she imagined, she would find a quiet restaurant somewhere in the city and eat something plain, soup, perhaps, or something with rice, because a week of fried things tends to bring the body gently back to what it most prefers when the wonder has been honored and the novelty has settled. Rimu mentioned that the Karaj restaurant near the station, Japanese fried chicken, seasoned with ginger and soy, had opened a few weeks earlier, and that she had been meaning to try it, and asked whether Marissa wanted to go that evening, since they had been talking about fried food long enough that hunger had become a quiet, patient presence in the room. Marissa agreed, and began folding the loose pages back into the guidebook, smoothing each one with the flat of her hand before tucking it carefully into place, taking a kind of slow and unhurried care with the object she had been carrying through these months of saving and imagining. They would go soon, she said. They would eat Karaj with rice and miso soup and a small pile of shredded cabbage on the side, and it would be a good dinner, modest and warm, and exactly the kind of meal that sustains you without asking anything of you in return. But before she stood, she sat for one more moment by the window, looking at the soft blur of the city lights in the evening air, and let herself think, one more time, about a fairground in Texas she had never visited, lit up in October, warm with the smell of oil and sugar, full of people eating things that had not existed until someone decided to try. There was something she loved about that image. She found herself thinking about the fact that someone had once looked at an ordinary stick of butter and quietly asked what would happen if you wrapped it in batter and placed it in oil, and that the answer had turned out to be something 40,000 people wanted to stand in line for. The world was full of such moments, small and curious and entirely human: the decision to try something new, the discovery that it worked, the slow and gentle spread of it from one place to another until it became part of the texture of a season, a city, a tradition that people carried without always knowing where it had begun. Outside, the city held its breath for a moment, the way cities sometimes do between the last of the evening and the first quiet of night, and the guidebook lay on the table with all its careful notes, patient and unhurried, waiting for the autumn that was still some months away. There was time yet for all of it, time for saving, for reading, for sitting in a warm room with a good friend and a cup of cooling tea and talking about all the things the world had to offer, all the things that existed in other seasons and other cities and other kitchens, golden and strange and worth the journey. And that, perhaps, is where this chapter rests for tonight, in a small apartment in a large city, in the soft and unhurried space between the end of the day and the beginning of sleep, where the most pleasant thoughts are the ones about places not yet visited, and meals not yet eaten, and all the quiet ways the world is always, still, a little wider than we remember it being. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet secrets settling back into the dark where they belong. There is no hurry now. If you need a moment, take one, let your breath slow, let your shoulders sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The night holds all the time in the world, and so do we. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, a place where the air moves gently and the sounds are soft and unhurried, like rain heard from the far end of a long, warm corridor. You need not follow every word, simply let the voice drift past you, like a lantern floating slowly down a still river, growing smaller, softer, further away. Somewhere in a small room in Japan, on some quiet evening when the rain was soft against the window, a man sat at his desk and let his thoughts return to the years he had spent living in America, the surprises large and small, the things that had settled into him and then refused, quietly, to leave. He had gone the way many people go, with a mind full of images, the wide boulevards and the bright interiors, the sense of a country so large it could hold entire weather systems within its borders, so various that no single image could contain it. And America had been all of that. Pause, and also something else, something quieter, harder to name, more human than the images had suggested. He had lived, during those years, in a region where distances between places were measured not in minutes but in hours, sometimes many hours, the kind of distances that slowly rearrange a person's understanding of what it means to want something and then to go and find it. What Americans called a medium-sized town was, in his reckoning, something like a small city in the far north of Japan, modest, cold, not much to speak of, and what they called a major destination might require 12 hours of driving across land that was wide and flat and beautiful in its own enormous, unhurried way. He remembered boarding a plane once simply to reach a shopping mall large enough to have what he needed, and then the long flight back the same afternoon, the same clouds below, the same land, and the quiet strangeness of returning to a room that felt different after so much movement, though nothing in it had changed. The distances were not only physical. Pause, they were the kind that settled into the bones, that changed what one felt entitled to expect from the world. In Japan, a warm drink had always been close at hand, the steady hum of a vending machine on nearly every corner, a row of cans lit softly from within, ready at the press of a button on even the coldest morning. In America, those machines were rarer, and when they appeared, a portion of them sat dark and unresponsive, the way things do when they have been asked to work for too long without being tended. On winter mornings in a snowy region, this small absence made itself known more than almost anything else, the simple comfort of a warm can held in both hands, a thing so ordinary at home that he had never once considered its value until it was simply not there. Breath, coffee shops filled some of that gap, and over time he came to understand why Americans gathered in them the way they did, why a well-known chain had grown out of the rainy northwest coast and spread itself across the country in the years since. In the northwest, the rain came not in bursts but in long patient seasons, and people needed somewhere warm to be, somewhere that smelled of something roasted, where the sound of rain against the windows was a background note rather than an event to shelter from. He found it curious that most people there did not carry umbrellas, that they simply accepted the moisture as part of the air, something to be moved through rather than avoided, and he thought about Japan, where the first drop of rain brings umbrellas out in great numbers from bags and pockets and shops. The sun was different elsewhere, in the south and in the long bright valleys, a stronger light than anything he had known at home, the kind that pressed against the eyes and made sunglasses less a fashion choice and more a simple necessity, the way waterproof shoes become necessary in autumn. He had thought, before going, that Americans wore sunglasses everywhere as a kind of performance, a cultural gesture toward a certain effortless cool, and he had not expected to stand one afternoon without a pair in the California light and find, simply standing there, that the eyes needed them, that the brightness was not a mood but a fact of the landscape. Many things were like that, he would later note, customs and habits that looked from the outside like affectation and revealed themselves, once you were living inside them, to be sensible responses to particular conditions. Pause? The food was its own kind of territory, and he spent time mapping it carefully and without hurry. Pizza was generous and good, and certain things from the large grocery delis were inexpensive and satisfying, and on those days he ate well in the easy, unhurried way that Americans ate, without ceremony, without a table arranged in any particular way, just food and a comfortable place to sit and the uncomplicated pleasure of being fed. But ramen, the simple bowl of noodles he had grown up eating without thinking about it, the thing that cost almost nothing in Japan and arrived without fanfare, became in America a small luxury, arriving at the table with a price that included tax and tip and a slow recognition that he had spent considerably more than expected on something that had once been effortless and everyday. He would mention this to people later, and they would nod, and he would see in their faces something he recognized, the quiet sympathy of people who know that wanting an ordinary comfort in an extraordinary place is one of the small, private heartaches of living far from home. The eggs tasted different, paler in the yolk, somehow, with a flatness he noticed every morning for a while before he stopped noticing, the way one eventually stops noticing most things that cannot be changed. Pause? But the avocados were wonderful, riper, and sweeter than any he had found in Japan, and he ate them often and with genuine pleasure, grateful for this particular generosity of the climate, this one thing the land offered freely and with ease. Breath? He thought a great deal about the way Americans greeted strangers on the street, a small thing, a nod, a murmured word, a brief acknowledgement of shared space, and he had taken it at first for the famous warmth he had been told to expect, the openness that people described when they spoke of Americans to those who had not yet been there. But over time, living inside it, he came to hear something quieter beneath the greeting, something older and more practical, a signal sent from one body to another that said, without ceremony, that the person passing meant no harm and wished only to continue on their way. He found this, once he understood it, not troubling but quietly moving, the way it named something ancient in people, a need to announce peaceable intent, to have that small announcement received and returned. He thought about Japan, where strangers pass in silence, where the street is shared without being acknowledged, and he wondered which custom was more honest, which more kind, the one that named its wariness gently and openly, or the one that kept its wariness folded quietly inside. Long pause? There were smaller customs that shifted his thinking more gradually. At home, shoes were removed at the door as a matter of course, and the apartment became a different kind of space inside, clean, bounded, separated from the outside world by that single deliberate act at the threshold. In America, shoes stayed on longer, through the entrance and into the rooms beyond, and he had to learn to hold this difference without discomfort, to accept that the border between inside and outside was simply drawn differently in this country, at a different point in the passage from one to the other. He was not the only Japanese person navigating these crossings, and he found, as people abroad tend to do, a loose community gathered around certain familiar things, particular shops, certain restaurants, foods that could bridge the long distance between here and home. The Japanese people he knew there held to their food with a devotion he understood completely, seeking out ingredients that had traveled long distances to be there, cooking in their apartments the things their families had cooked, maintaining through taste a thread that reached all the way back. He had felt this himself, the way a bowl of something that tasted like home could make the distance feel, for a moment, manageable, a small miracle of the senses, private and deeply necessary. Pause? Breath? He remembered a roommate from a time when the world had grown very small, when doors stayed closed and the days folded into one another without the relief of ordinary movement. The young man had come from far away, gentle and quiet in the way of someone new to a place, and they had shared their small apartment amicably, each keeping mostly to himself, each maintaining the polite consideration of strangers who wish each other well but have not yet learned one another. As the weeks of confinement lengthened into months, something in the young man began to shift, slowly, the way pressure builds in a place that has no outlet, the way a room changes when the window has been sealed too long and the air inside stops moving. There was no single moment he could identify when the change became visible, only a gradual awareness that the quiet of the apartment had become a different kind of quiet, less restful, more dense, as though the air itself were holding something it could not release. One day the young man left, in a way that was abrupt and difficult to witness, and then there was silence, and the man found himself alone in the apartment with the evidence of something that had fractured and then departed. Pause? He spent an afternoon restoring what he could, and then he sat for a while in the changed room and let himself feel a quiet sorrow for the young man, who had simply been someone under too much pressure in too small a space, which could happen, he knew, to anyone, anywhere, given enough time and not enough room. He did not recount this story, even years later, with alarm or blame, but with a gentle sadness for the young man and a recognition that what looks like strangeness from the outside is very often just pain that has run out of room. Pause. He had learned from that time something about his own limits as well, something about what he needed, and what kinds of distance and closeness were sustainable for him, and what were not. Breath? There were practical things he had not foreseen, the paycheck that arrived twice a month as a paper slip, requiring a visit to the bank window and a transaction conducted face-to-face with a teller, a process that felt to him like something from another era, something his parents might have described from decades earlier. He made a mistake once with a credit card, misunderstanding the payment system, and the card was stopped, and he would recount this later with a wry quietness, noting that it was entirely possible he might never be eligible for an American credit card again for the rest of his life, and finding in this small permanent consequence something almost endearing. The bureaucratic mishaps of living in another country became, over time, a kind of private comedy, the things that went wrong in ways entirely specific to that place, that could not have gone wrong in exactly that way anywhere else. On local television, politicians sometimes ran personal advertisements, a face, a name, a phone number, an invitation to call if something in the neighborhood or community needed attention, a directness of access he had not encountered in quite the same form at home. He found this unexpectedly admirable, and he carried the observation with him, turning it over on quiet evenings in the way one turns over a small useful idea, wondering where it might fit and what it might grow into. Pause? Long pause? In the end, after years, he came home. He remembered the long flight back over the Pacific, the dark hours over the water, the strange suspension of being between countries, belonging to neither for a little while, held briefly in the mild nowhere of open sky. And then the lights of Japan below, the dense, orderly lights of a country where things were close together, where convenience was woven into the everyday, where a warm drink could be bought from a machine on any corner at any hour of the night. He remembered stepping into a convenience store near the airport after landing, just to stand in it for a moment, in the familiar light, among the neat rows of things, the gentle background music, the smell of the warm food counter, and understanding, simply standing there, how much that small and ordinary room had meant to him while he was away from it. Some weeks later, he sat in a McDonald's near his home and noticed at a nearby table a group of very old women, perhaps in their late 70s or 80s, gathered with the ease of people who have been meeting in such places for decades. They were talking softly and eating with no particular ceremony, and he watched them for a moment with quiet affection, recognizing in their unhurried comfort that what seems ordinary to those inside a culture is often the most sustaining thing, the thing that holds the shape of a life from the inside. For those women, a hamburger was not a foreign thing or a convenient thing, it was something that had been part of their world for many decades, something that tasted, in its way, like continuity and ease, and he found this quietly beautiful, the way simple and enduring things so often are. Pause? What he brought back, he came to believe, was not certainty but a different kind of curiosity, a habit of asking what was underneath the surface before reaching for a judgment, a tendency to wait before deciding what a thing meant. The sunglasses had made sense because of the light. Pause, the coffee shops had made sense because of the rain. The greetings on sidewalks had made sense because of something old and careful that people carry in themselves wherever they go. Things that had seemed like performance or affectation had turned out, again and again, to be practical and reasoned and rooted in the specific conditions of that particular land, that particular weather, that particular history. He had gone expecting one country and found many, the country of the coasts and the country of the interior, the country of the cities and the vast patient country of the places in between, each with its own understanding of what home meant and how far one could be expected to travel to reach it. He had not found it easy, all of it. Pause, there had been winters that were long and lonely, and ordinary days when the small difficulties accumulated into something heavier than he had expected, and evenings when the distance felt very large and the room felt very small. But there had also been coffee in the rain, and ripe avocados in the afternoon sun, and strangers on sidewalks whose murmured greetings he had come to understand only slowly, and old women comfortable in their ordinary world, and a land that was patient and enormous and full of things he had not known enough to expect. He had not loved all of it. Pause, but he had come to understand more of it than he had arrived with, and that seemed, over time, like something, like the particular warmth that follows a long journey, the one you only feel once you are finally, truly home. He closed his notebook, there in the small room, and the lamp was warm, and outside the rain continued in its quiet, unhurried way, a sound more felt than heard, a soft presence against the window that asked nothing of him and needed nothing in return. And somewhere across the Pacific, the land was still wide and cold in some places and bright in others, and the coffee shops were full of people sheltering from the rain, and the vending machines stood on their corners, some lit, some dark, as they always had. And all of it went on, patient and various, full of its own meaning, whether anyone was there to notice it or not. And that, perhaps, is where we leave him for tonight, in the warm lamplight, in the sound of the rain, with the quiet, unhurried knowledge of a man who went far away and came back knowing something he had not known before. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet mysteries fading softly, like breath on a winter window. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one. Let your shoulders settle a little more into the warmth beneath you, let your breath move slowly, in and then out, easy and unheld. The night holds plenty of room for stillness. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, somewhere gentler, a place where the world outside has grown very distant, and the only sounds are small, familiar ones. We will arrive there together in just a moment. For now, simply rest. Somewhere in the slow hours of an ordinary evening, when the neighborhood outside had settled into its familiar murmur, she sat at the low kitchen table and looked at what remained of her dinner. The meal had been simple, miso soup cooling in its bowl, rice still warm inside its wooden container, a few slices of pickled vegetable arranged without ceremony on a small blue dish, the kind of meal that asks nothing of the person eating it. She had not been thinking of anything in particular, letting her mind move the way minds do in the late evening, loosely, without direction, the way water moves when there is no wind to give it shape. Something had surfaced, slowly, from an earlier conversation, a question her younger colleague had mentioned at work that afternoon, so casually that she almost hadn't registered it at the time. She had said, wondering aloud over her lunch, why it was that America seemed to carry this particular weight in the world, this persistent conversation about food and bodies and health, and what lay underneath the numbers everyone seemed to know without quite understanding. The numbers, when she had looked them up later that evening, were not what she had expected, not because they were incomprehensible, but because they were so much larger than the image she had carried in her mind. She had assumed, as many people do, that a country celebrated for its athletes and its culture of sport and its endless landscape of outdoor possibility would carry a relatively modest rate of obesity in its population. What she found instead was something closer to 4 in every 10 Americans, a proportion so steady across so many years of data that it had the feeling not of an emergency but of a settled condition, a shape the country had gradually grown into. She sat with that number for a while, not in judgment, but in the quiet effort of understanding, because she had come to believe that numbers without context are almost useless, like a map that shows roads but not terrain, distances but not difficulty. The map she kept returning to in her mind was one she had found online, a rendering of the continental United States rendered in deep red, and at first glance she had assumed it was something political, something to do with elections or temperatures or weather systems. But the red dots, she had realized slowly, each one marked the location of a McDonald's restaurant, all of them, every single location across every state, and the density of that red had required a moment to absorb properly. She was not one to moralize about fast food, having grown up with those familiar golden arches as a presence in her own city, in the way that vending machines and convenience stores are simply part of the landscape of modern Japanese life, neither good nor bad, simply there. But the scale of what the map showed was different from anything she had expected. The coverage was not merely widespread but nearly total, a network so thoroughly distributed that almost no part of the country sat beyond its reach. And she understood, thinking about it in the quiet of her kitchen, that availability is its own kind of force, that when something is always near, always open, always priced low enough to be accessible, it becomes less of a choice and more of a gravitational pull. Choice, she found herself thinking, is not really free when the options are so unequal in their convenience and their cost, when one path is wide and well-lit and the other requires effort, distance, money, and time. She recalled reading carefully through the definition of obesity, the clinical language of it, not simply being heavy, but existing in a state where the body's weight has moved beyond what medicine considers sustainable for long-term health. The measurement used around the world is the body mass index, a ratio of weight to height that produces a single number, meant to serve as a rough orientation rather than a precise diagnosis, a starting point rather than a final word. In Japan, she had known her own number for years, the way most health-conscious adults do, because it appears on the printout at the end of the annual health check, the Nenkan Kenshin, that quiet yearly ritual of standing still while the machines take their measurements. Japan's threshold is set at 25, lower than the international standard of 30, because research had revealed that Asian bodies tend to accumulate internal fat at a different rate, the risk becoming apparent earlier along the scale, before the number has climbed very high. She found this detail both interesting and slightly humbling, the idea that the same number could carry different meanings depending on the body holding it, that health is not a universal arithmetic but something more particular, more personal, more shaped by ancestry and history than a single formula could contain. And yet the body mass index had its limits, she remembered. An athlete dense with muscle might register as overweight by the numbers even while running marathons at dawn, and the doctors who devised the measure were themselves the first to acknowledge this. The health consequences associated with obesity, as she had read them, were extensive, a long list of conditions that become more likely as weight increases, each one a kind of compounding on the last, the body carrying more than its systems were designed to sustain indefinitely. Type 2 diabetes was the one most people mentioned first, the slow deterioration of the body's ability to manage its own blood sugar, driven by fat accumulating around the organs and interfering with the signaling that insulin is meant to carry. And then there was high blood pressure, the heart working harder than it should, the blood vessels carrying more than they were built to bear, the whole circulatory system under a sustained and largely invisible strain that accumulates over years before making itself known. She thought about the word burden, how often it appeared in discussions of health, the burden on the heart, the burden on the joints, the burden on the healthcare system, and how rarely it appeared in discussions of the conditions that created these situations in the first place. Because what she had come to understand, reading slowly through the research over several evenings, was that the causes of America's obesity rates were not simply personal, not simply a matter of individual choice or discipline or desire, as the word choice so often implies. The data from the Centers for Disease Control, published in 2020, had shown that the rate was highest not among the wealthiest households, as she had vaguely assumed, but among those with the lowest incomes, a reversal that she sat with for some time. She had carried, without quite realizing it, an unexamined assumption that excess was a consequence of abundance, that the richest people ate most richly, and that richness led to excess, but the research suggested instead that poverty creates its own nutritional logic, shaped not by abundance but by constraint. When the grocery store is an hour away by car, or not there at all, and when the fast food counter is 3 minutes from the front door, and when the fast food meal costs less than the vegetables at the distant market, the decision about what to eat is made long before anyone sits down at a table. researchers had a phrase for the neighborhoods where fresh and nutritious food was difficult or impossible to find. They called them food deserts, a term she found both precise and quietly devastating, the image of an environment stripped of nourishment by forces that had nothing to do with the people living there. In these areas, she read, supermarkets were absent or distant, and what remained were convenience stores and fast food counters, places where the food was calorie-dense and nutrient-sparse, filling enough to quiet hunger but not truly sufficient to sustain. And the predictable outcome of that landscape, over years and decades, was exactly what the numbers showed: communities shaped by their environment into patterns of eating that no amount of individual willpower, applied in isolation, could easily override. There was also the question of children, which she had found difficult to read about with complete equanimity, the way that food companies and fast food chains had long directed their most persuasive marketing toward the youngest consumers. Not merely reaching children, but targeting them deliberately, using the knowledge that preferences formed in childhood tend to persist, that a child who associates a particular brand with comfort and pleasure will often carry that association for decades, long past the age of choosing. Television advertisements, games, signs near schools, the effort was thorough and sustained, and she understood it as a business logic, however uncomfortable that understanding felt, a rational calculation made in the pursuit of long-term loyalty. She thought about a study she had read from Harvard School of Public Health, which had looked forward from the current trends and suggested that if nothing changed substantially, more than half of the American adult population might meet the clinical definition of obesity within the coming decade. Half, she let that word rest in the kitchen for a moment, in the space between one thought and the next, not as a cause for alarm but simply as a measure of scale, a sense of how large the question had become. And the economic dimension of it was significant too. The estimate that obesity-related healthcare costs accounted for roughly 1/5 of all medical spending in the United States, that an obese patient incurred on average several $1,000s more in annual costs than a non-obese one. These numbers ripple outward, she found herself thinking. They are not contained within the lives of the individuals they describe, but distributed across everyone who participates in the systems of healthcare and insurance and public spending. She turned then, in her mind, toward Japan, toward the country she knew more intimately, its particular habits and pressures and tendencies, the way it was carrying its own version of this conversation in a quieter register. Japan's rates were nothing like America's, the numbers far smaller by the international measure. Only about 4.5% of adults fell above the body mass index threshold of 30 when the global standard was applied. But the picture was more complicated than it appeared, because Japan's own health organizations used the lower threshold of 25, recognizing that Asian bodies accumulate visceral fat, the internal kind, gathered around organs, more readily than the overall weight number might suggest. By that measure, roughly 1 in 3 Japanese men was considered overweight, and among men in their 40s and 50s the proportion rose toward 40%, a figure that had surprised her, because the Japan she moved through daily seemed, in its public life, so oriented toward moderation. There was a theory she had come across, repeated carefully across several different sources, about a gene sometimes called the thrifty gene, a tendency, more common in East Asian populations, toward storing energy efficiently in times of plenty, a trait that had been a genuine advantage in eras of scarcity and famine. In an earlier time, when food was uncertain and physical labor was constant, this tendency to conserve was protective, the body making the most of what it received, holding reserves against seasons of want. But in a modern environment of sedentary work and readily available food, the same tendency became a different kind of burden, the body still conserving for a scarcity that no longer came, storing what it was not given sufficient reason to release. She thought about that quietly, the way adaptations made for one world can become liabilities in another, the way the body carries the memory of conditions that no longer apply, faithfully maintaining strategies whose original purpose has been dissolved by time. There was something almost tender in it, she felt, not quite sad, but close, the recognition that the body is not wrong, exactly, only carrying knowledge from a different era, a different landscape, a set of instructions written for circumstances that have quietly changed. There was also a correlation she had found unexpected, a relationship between rising obesity rates among young Japanese men and rising rates of remaining unmarried, a statistical association that researchers had noted with care, not wanting to draw conclusions too firmly from numbers alone. The hypothesis, offered tentatively in the papers she had read, was that men living alone tend to eat more often at restaurants and convenience stores, and that those eating patterns, over time, tend toward the calorie-dense and nutritionally sparse, not from any failure of intention, but from the simple practical geometry of single life. She was uncertain whether she found the hypothesis fully convincing, but she found it interesting, the idea that something as large as a demographic shift might leave traces in the quiet daily question of what to eat for dinner, alone, at a table set for one. Prevention, she had read, was both simpler and harder than it sounded, simpler in principle, harder in practice, requiring not just individual awareness but changes in the environments where decisions are actually made. Vegetables and whole grains and less sugar, the nutritional science on these things is not particularly disputed, and she had known it all in a general way since childhood, but the capacity to act on that knowledge depends heavily on what is available, what is affordable, and how much energy remains at the end of a long working day. The programs that had shown the most consistent results were not the ones that told people what they should choose, but the ones that changed what was easy to reach, that put affordable fresh food within walking distance, that reduced the gap in price and convenience between the nutritious and the quick. She thought of the small daily choices she herself made, the longer walk through the park, the meal prepared at home even when the convenience store was just downstairs, the stairs taken rather than the elevator, and she recognized that these choices were easy for her in ways they were not easy for everyone. She had time, and a kitchen, and the habit of cooking passed down over years by watching her mother's hands move through familiar recipes. These were not things she had earned so much as inherited, and she held that thought without guilt, simply as a fact worth acknowledging. The evening had grown quieter as she sat there, the rain having slowed to almost nothing outside, the kitchen holding its warmth like something cupped carefully between two hands. She looked at the small blue dish, at the few remaining slices of pickled vegetable, at the wooden rice container with its lid slightly askew, all the ordinary objects of an ordinary meal, unremarkable in the way that most good things are. And she thought that food is never only food, it is geography and economics and the memory of a mother's kitchen, it is availability and habit and the long slow work of culture shaping appetite, shaping the body, shaping the shape of a life. She did not feel alarmed by any of it, sitting there in the quiet, not by the statistics, not by the projections, not by the complex webs of cause and effect that researchers were still carefully working to understand. She felt, instead, something closer to compassion, for the person choosing fast food because it is all that is near, for the child whose preferences were shaped before she could choose them, for the body carrying a gene optimized for a world that has quietly, gradually, been replaced by a different one. There are forces larger than any individual at work in these patterns, she found herself thinking, and the appropriate response to those forces is not contempt but a kind of patient, structural attention, the willingness to look clearly at the environment before looking at the person standing in it. She put the lid gently back on the rice container, carried the blue dish to the sink, and stood for a moment at the window, looking out at the city, its light softened and blurred by the remnants of the evening's rain. The streets below were quiet now, and somewhere in the middle distance a convenience store glowed with its particular unwavering brightness, its shelves just visible from where she stood, arranged and waiting, patient in the small hours. She had always found something quietly comforting about those lights, not the food, exactly, but the light itself, the sense of something available in the dark, some assurance that the city was still there, still open, still going gently on. She turned from the window and moved toward the bedroom, pausing once to switch off the kitchen lamp, leaving the room to the faint warmth of light coming in from outside. And the question her colleague had asked all those weeks ago, why, exactly, why, seemed, in the quiet of that moment, not like something that required a single sharp answer, but something more patient, more layered, more honest in its complexity than any single explanation could hold. It was the kind of question that is best carried gently, she felt, held in the way you hold something that matters without quite knowing yet what to do with it, with care, and without hurry, and with the long view. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, not with a conclusion, but with the quiet understanding that some questions are most honestly kept in the dark, with the rain gone and the lamp off and the stillness settling softly all around them. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way a half-remembered dream fades when morning is still far away. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take it, let your shoulders sink a little deeper, let the breath come and go on its own, slow and even, without effort. The night is patient. The quiet around you is patient. And when you are ready, though truly, there is no rush, our next story takes us to a quieter setting, a small room, a soft lamp, the kind of ordinary place where something unexpected, and somehow comforting, once happened. Just rest. Just breathe. We will find our way there together, gently. Somewhere in the long months before he left Japan, the young man had grown accustomed to a particular kind of story, the kind that arrived through the television screen in the evenings, soft and reassuring as the light from a low lamp. The programs he watched were fond of Japan in the way that a doting relative might be fond of a child, pointing out every small excellence, noting the precision of its seasons, the artistry of its food, the admiration that visitors from distant countries seemed to carry home with them like a small, carefully wrapped gift. He absorbed these stories the way one absorbs warmth from a heater on a winter afternoon, not thinking about the source of the warmth, only noticing that the room felt comfortable and that some part of him settled in response. Slowly, without his quite noticing, a feeling had taken shape inside him, something like the quiet assumption that Japan was a country the world looked toward with fondness, that its name, spoken in a foreign room, would carry a certain weight. He was not, by nature, a boastful person, and the feeling was not so much pride as it was a kind of settled expectation, the way a person expects the sun will be there in the morning without making any particular effort to believe it. When the paperwork came through and the flight was booked and his mother ironed the shirts he would take to America, he carried that assumption with him like something folded carefully into the inner pocket of his coat, something he did not think to open and examine. The journey itself was long and dreamlike, the way long journeys are, full of small discomforts and narrow seats and a sky that shifted color through the oval window as the hours passed over the Pacific, that immense and indifferent water. He landed somewhere new and was folded into the routines of a campus he did not yet understand, a dormitory with thin walls and hallways that smelled of something he could not quite name, a schedule of classes that began before he felt entirely ready. The first class was the kind where introductions are made, where each student stands and offers their name and where they have come from, and he had thought about this moment, had turned it over in his mind on the plane and in the dormitory the night before. He stood and offered his name, and then the words that felt, to him, like something significant, the words that announced the country he had come from, the country with the beautiful seasons and the celebrated food and the technology the programs had spent so many evenings praising. The room was polite in the way that rooms full of strangers tend to be polite, which is to say that it moved on, that the next student stood and offered their own name, and the introduction passed as quietly as a leaf falling somewhere in a courtyard that no one happens to be watching. The teacher was kind and professional and noted his name in the way that teachers note all names, with the particular attention of someone whose work requires remembering, and that attention was genuine and he felt it, and was grateful for it. But the room itself had moved on, and the thing he had half imagined, that small flicker of particular recognition, that warmth the television programs had made him expect, had simply not arrived. He found himself returning to that moment in the days that followed, turning it over with the gentle persistence of someone working a smooth stone between their fingers, not angry, not hurt exactly, only quietly puzzled in a way he did not yet have words for. The week settled into rhythms, as weeks always do when you stay somewhere long enough, and he found companions in the way exchange students tend to find them, through proximity and shared uncertainty and the slow discovery of common ground in places he had not expected. 3 months passed in this way, and by the time 3 months had passed the campus had become familiar in its outlines if not yet in its deeper language, and he had learned the hours of the cafeteria and the shortcuts between buildings and which vending machine was most reliable in the afternoons. One day, with no particular occasion to mark it, he found himself in a common room with students from 3 other countries, a young man from Norway, another from somewhere in the American Midwest, and a third from England, and the conversation had been easy and wandering in the way of afternoons with no particular purpose. On the wall of that common room there was a world map, one of those large, slightly faded maps that appear in institutional spaces, the corners perhaps curling just a little, a map that had probably been there for many years without anyone paying it much attention. He had been looking at it absently, the way one looks at things in common rooms, and on a gentle impulse he posed what he thought of as a simple and natural question, asking his companions if they could point to Japan on that map. The Norwegian leaned forward and studied the map with what seemed like genuine interest, and pointed, with a certain easy confidence, to a country that was not Japan but was somewhere in the general vicinity of East Asia, a wide gesture that carried the feeling of a reasonable attempt. The American looked at the map with a mild, unhurried expression and pointed to an island nation further south, somewhere in the archipelagos that stretch between the continent and the open Pacific, and he nodded slightly as though he felt reasonably certain. The student from England looked at the map thoughtfully for a moment and pointed to a long, narrow country on the mainland, one that shares certain coastal shapes with the outline he was picturing, and he offered his answer with the calm composure of someone who has nothing much invested in being right. All 3 answers were in the right part of the world, more or less, the way guesses often are, carrying a kind of general truth even when the specific fact is absent, and he corrected them gently, tracing the actual shape of the islands with one finger. And what he noticed, the thing that settled into him quietly and stayed through the rest of that afternoon and into the evening, was not that they had been wrong, because being wrong about where a country sits on a map is the most ordinary thing in the world. What he noticed was that they had not been embarrassed by the question, that they had simply pointed and been wrong in the easy, unbothered way of people for whom this particular piece of information had never been something they needed to carry. Japan had not been, for them, the kind of country whose location you would hold in the back of your mind the way you might hold the location of a city someone you loved had once mentioned, or a place you had promised yourself you would someday visit. It was simply one country among many, somewhere in the large and complicated eastern portion of the world, a place that existed without needing to be precisely located, the way most of the world exists for most people most of the time, present but not pressing. He stood at the map for a little while after his companions had moved on to something else, looking at the shape of Japan on that particular rendering of the world, and he noticed something he had not quite registered before. The map on the wall was centered on the Atlantic Ocean, as most maps in that part of the world tend to be, with the Americas arranged along the left side and Europe and Africa near the middle and Asia placed along the right edge of the frame. Japan, on this map, was near the right margin, compact and precise, tucked between the open Pacific and the edge of the image, its shape unchanged and recognizable, but differently placed than he was accustomed to seeing it, as though the whole world had been quietly rearranged. The maps he had grown up with had placed Japan near the center, which is the natural and understandable thing for a country to do with its maps, to put itself at the heart of the image, and arrange the rest of the world around the familiar anchor of home. Every country does this, he came to understand in the weeks that followed. Every country centers itself in its own imagination, and the rest of the world radiates outward from that center in patterns that feel entirely natural to those who grew up within them. And this was not vanity, exactly, or at least not only vanity, it was simply what it is to live somewhere, to have one place be the place you return to, the place from which all distances are measured, the place that feels, without argument, like the middle of things. He thought about the television programs he had watched growing up, the ones that had carefully assembled a portrait of Japan admired and sought after and fascinating to the foreign eye, and he understood them a little differently now, standing in front of that different map. Those programs were not exactly wrong, he found himself thinking, because the admiration they described was real in its way. There are people in every country who find Japan beautiful and its food remarkable and its particular way of doing things worth seeking out and worth keeping. But admiration of that kind lives in specific people, in those who have been curious enough to look, and it does not spread uniformly across whole populations the way water spreads across a flat surface. It gathers in pockets, in particular hearts, in the people who happen to be drawn to it. It had simply not occurred to the people who made those programs to show the larger and more complicated picture, the one in which Japan is one of many countries, each remarkable in its own way, each the center of its own inner world and the edge of everyone else's. And he had watched those programs and absorbed their gentle, flattering portrait of things, and carried it with him across the Pacific like a map he had never thought to question, because it had always felt so completely reliable, so much like simply knowing something true. Now he was learning to read a different map, a larger one, less centered, more complicated, one in which you could more easily lose your bearings but also, perhaps, find things you had not been looking for and would not have found if you had always known exactly where you were. The feeling he would later remember from that afternoon was something like a small hollow opening up in the space where the assumption had been, a quiet emptiness that was not quite sadness and not quite relief, but something in between, something that needed a little time to become itself. But emptiness is not always an uncomfortable thing, he came to understand, because it is also a kind of space, and spaces can be filled with something other than what was there before, something chosen rather than simply received without examination. He began to pay attention differently in the months that followed, to notice the particular things that were genuinely interesting about where he had come from, the things that had value not because a program had declared them worthy but because he himself, having now seen other things, could see them with his own eyes. The seasons, for instance, which the programs had often celebrated in a way that felt slightly rehearsed, he found he actually missed in a simple, undefended way, the particular quality of autumn light in the part of Japan where he had grown up, the way the air changed in October. And the food, which he had eaten his whole life without thinking much about it, took on a specific texture of meaning in its absence, the way things often do when you are far from them and cannot have them without considerable effort. He was also learning, in the ordinary way of being somewhere new for long enough, that people he had not expected to understand him sometimes did, and that the distances between people who had grown up very differently were smaller than they appeared from a distance. The Norwegian who had pointed at the wrong country became someone he enjoyed sitting with in the evenings, and they had long, wandering conversations about things that had nothing to do with geography or national identity or any of the questions that had felt so pressing in the beginning. The American who had pointed at the island archipelago knew a great deal about music and talked about it with a generosity and enthusiasm that made the conversations feel genuinely nourishing, and neither of them thought very often about maps. The months continued to accumulate in this way, settling into a kind of education that was different from the one happening in the classrooms but perhaps not less valuable, an education in the particular texture of how things actually are when you remove the frame that has always surrounded them. He wrote letters home sometimes, and in those letters he tried to describe what he was learning, though the words were not always adequate to the feeling, which was complicated in the way that real changes of understanding tend to be complicated, resistant to neat summary. His mother wrote back in the careful handwriting he had always known, asking about his health and his sleep and whether the food was adequate, and the ordinariness of those questions was itself a kind of comfort, a reminder that some things remained steady while other things shifted. He had gone to America expecting a particular kind of recognition, and that recognition had not come in the form he had imagined, and now, on the other side of that small disappointment, he found he was not entirely sorry for how things had unfolded. The picture of Japan he carried now was more accurate, he thought, which meant it was more modest in some ways and more genuinely his own in others, a picture he had partly assembled himself rather than received whole from a screen in a warm room on an ordinary evening. There is something about a belief that has been tested and found to be partial, something that makes the parts which survive the testing feel more solid, more worth holding, more worth returning to when you are tired and far from home. He did not stop feeling that Japan was worth caring about, but he stopped needing it to be famous in order to care about it, and the difference between those two things turned out to be larger than he would have guessed, a difference you can only measure by living through it. Later, when the year had come to its end and he was home again, sitting in a room that smelled of tatami and listening to the sound of rain on the roof, he remembered the map on the wall of that common room, Japan in its small, precise space near the right margin. And he thought that perhaps every place is near the margin of someone else's map, and every place is also the center of its own, and both of these things are true at the same time, without either of them cancelling the other out or making the other less real. The rain continued outside, steady and unhurried, the kind of rain that settles in for the night without apology, and he listened to it with something that had no exact name, something between contentment and the gentle weariness that comes after a journey that has taken more from you than you expected. And perhaps what he had lost was only a kind of innocence that needed, sooner or later, to be exchanged for something more useful, something he could actually carry without it weighing him down, a map made of things he had seen himself rather than things he had only been told. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, in a quiet room, with rain on the roof, and a young man who went somewhere far away and came back carrying a different map than the one he had taken with him, lighter, more honest, and in its own way more his own. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its shadows soften and dissolve, the way all things dissolve at the edge of sleep. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take it now, a slow breath in, and a slower breath out, your body a little heavier against whatever holds you. The night is patient with you. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, somewhere smaller and gentler, where the air carries the faint smell of old wood and rain on roof tiles, and the world outside has already gone still. We will find our way there together, unhurried, as the darkness around you grows soft and welcoming, and the distance between waking and dreaming grows thinner with every breath. Somewhere in the small hours of a rainy evening, a man named Shu sat at the low desk in his Tokyo apartment and let the memories of another country settle around him, slowly and without urgency, the way night mist settles over the surface of a quiet river. He had lived in America for several years, long enough to stop noticing what had first seemed strange, and then long enough again to begin noticing what was quietly wonderful, and then, in the end, long enough to feel the particular tiredness that comes from loving two places at once and belonging entirely to neither. His notebook lay open before him, its pages soft with handling, the writing inside a mixture of Japanese and English that he no longer thought of as unusual, the way a person stops noticing the seam of a jacket after they have worn it long enough that it simply becomes part of how clothing feels against the body. He had written near the top of one page, in small careful letters, that the first thing to understand about America was that it was nothing like its image, and also, in certain unexpected ways, exactly as imagined, both things true at once, depending on which part of the country you were standing in and which hour of the day it happened to be. He had grown up knowing Kentucky Fried Chicken as a holiday ritual, a carefully anticipated treat, and had arrived in America to find that this was merely the visible edge of something far wider, that the country possessed its own vast landscape of fried chicken establishments, each claiming a different regional loyalty, each with its own seasoning philosophy and its own devoted following across the long geography of the place. There was Popeyes, which came from Louisiana and carried that state's particular confidence in its flavoring, and there was Church's, which bore a Texan spirit in its very name, and he recalled sitting in a plastic booth during his first visit to Popeyes, watching the late afternoon light come in warm and sideways through the window, finding the seasoning rougher and more forward than anything he had grown up with, less the careful precision he had known at home, and more like someone had decided that restraint was simply not among their values. The mashed potatoes, he wrote, were another matter entirely, deeply salted, generously prepared, the kind of uncomplicated thing that required nothing of you except to sit still and eat it slowly, and he had been quietly surprised to find himself returning to them, again and again, through the years of his American life. The sweet iced tea that accompanied most meals in the southern regions of the country had taken him considerable time to accept, and had then become, almost without his noticing, one of the small pleasures he still thought about on humid Tokyo evenings, when the air was thick and the tea in his cup was properly plain and the memory of something cold and sweetened had a certain gentle pull to it. He had lived for a year near a Five Guys, and the first time he had ordered there and received the bag across the counter, he had stood for a moment simply holding it and looking at it. The quantity of fries inside was not a portion so much as a declaration, golden and slightly reckless, tumbling out of the container in a way that suggested the restaurant had taken a philosophical position on the question of enough, and had decided that enough was not what they were offering. The woman who had handed him the bag had watched him with the patient expression of someone who had seen this particular face many times before, the face of a person who thought they understood what they were ordering and has discovered, in a single moment, that they did not, and she had said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and he had carried the bag to a table and sat quietly with it for a while before beginning to eat. He had written in his notebook, some days later, that portion size in America was not merely a cultural habit but something closer to an argument, a declaration that more was not just more, but was, in a certain spirit, a form of welcome extended to the body before a word had been spoken. The diners were the places he had come to love most steadily and most lastingly, those modest, unassuming establishments at the edges of roads and the corners of certain city blocks, where the hours ran long and the menu never truly changed and a thin, pale coffee was always ready in a white ceramic mug without anyone needing to be asked. He had read, and come to understand as true, that many of these diners were owned and operated by families who had come from Greece, that the menus carried within them, quietly and without announcement, the traces of a different culinary inheritance, the familiar American breakfast items sitting comfortably alongside dishes that spoke of another shore and a different century entirely. There had been waitresses who, finding little to occupy them in the slow middle of an afternoon, would lean against the counter and begin to ask him questions, where he was from, what had brought him here, what the winters were like in Japan, whether he missed the food, and these conversations had been among the most unexpectedly warming experiences of his time in that country, small and brief and genuine in the way of things that ask nothing and offer something freely anyway. It was a quality he had tried to describe to friends after returning home, this American ease with strangers, and had not quite managed to convey adequately the way a person in a diner or a grocery line might simply begin to talk, without ceremony or preliminary, as though the presence of another human being were invitation enough. He had come to understand, over time, that this warmth and the loneliness that sometimes lived beneath it were not contradictions but companions, that a country built by people who had all traveled very far from wherever they began might develop, in its public character, a brightness that served partly as greeting and partly as something to hold the distance between people at a bearable remove. The friendliness was real, he had concluded, not merely performance, but it lived alongside something more interior and more guarded, a genuine privacy at the center of many American lives that the warmth on the surface did not always manage to reach, and he had thought about this carefully since returning home, wondering whether the Japanese way of extending warmth more slowly, through smaller and more specific gestures across longer stretches of time, was better or simply different, and had arrived each time at the same quiet place, that both were forms of trying, and trying was its own kind of care. The movie theaters had surprised him, not the films themselves, but the experience of watching them in American cinemas, where the audience moved and spoke and responded to what was happening on the screen in ways that had seemed, during his first weeks, almost incomprehensible to him. He had sat in the dark and heard people around him call out responses, laugh openly and without restraint, share observations with strangers across rows in voices that were not whispers, and had felt the specific discomfort of someone who has carried the conventions of one room into a room where different conventions are in effect. By the fourth or fifth visit, he had begun to understand that this was not disorder but a different arrangement of order, that the communal experience of watching a film in that country was understood as genuinely communal, an event to be shared rather than attended in solitude alongside other solitary people, and he had grown, gradually, less certain that his own preference for quiet was the only reasonable response to something moving or funny on a screen. The roads had taught him slower and more lasting lessons, the four-way stop signs at intersections where traffic lights were absent, the careful choreography of cars taking turns in an order that no one directed but everyone seemed to understand, as though the rule had been internalized so completely that it no longer required stating aloud. He had once sat at the edge of a freeway merge and watched, for several quiet minutes, as two streams of traffic fell into a perfect alternating rhythm, left, right, without hesitation, without impatience, each car giving way to the next in a sequence that felt both entirely ordinary and, in that particular moment, quietly remarkable. The sight had moved him more than he expected, and he had written about it afterward with more feeling than he usually brought to observations about traffic, noting that he had felt, watching those two lanes find their rhythm, something he could only describe as hope, the particular kind that does not announce itself or ask to be noticed. The yield signs on freeway on-ramps had confused him for longer than he was comfortable admitting, the idea that you might enter a stream of fast-moving traffic on the basis of something as fragile and reliable as mutual goodwill, but he had come to find, in time, a kind of honesty in that too. The old cars remained on the roads long past the age at which Japanese vehicles would have retired, rolling along wide boulevards with a dignified persistence, their paint softened by years of sun to something almost beautiful in its fading, their engines audible half a block before they arrived, announcing themselves without apology. He had always found something comforting about things that kept working past the point where they might reasonably have stopped, that refused, quietly and without drama, to accept the verdict that their usefulness had ended, and he had noticed these old cars with a fondness that seemed, to him, slightly out of proportion but felt genuine nonetheless. The healthcare had been the heaviest thing he carried home, not as a personal catastrophe, but as a witnessed accumulation of stories that had rearranged certain assumptions he had made without knowing he was making them. A colleague he had worked beside for nearly a year, a man of calm and competent character whom he respected, had developed a cavity, the kind of small and ordinary trouble that visits the body without warning, and had returned from the dentist some days later with a quietness that was different from his usual quietness, and had mentioned, in the most neutral voice he could produce, that the treatment had cost approximately what he earned in a month. Shu had sat with that information for a long time afterward, turning it over carefully the way you turn over something you want to understand fully before setting it down, thinking about how differently the body was valued in different systems, how the same tooth, in two different countries, could mean such very different things for what a person was able to worry about and what they were able to leave safely alone. He had been carrying supplemental insurance throughout his stay, had assumed it was sufficient, had learned only gradually that dental care was categorized separately from the rest of medical coverage, as though teeth were considered a distinct concern from the body that housed them, their maintenance a matter of personal choice rather than basic continuity. He had eventually found his way to a dentist who worked with Japanese-speaking patients and charged rates that were, by local standards, considered reasonable, and had felt, sitting in that chair with the small paper bib tucked under his collar and the clean smell of the room around him, a gratitude for his home country's medical system that he had simply never had occasion to feel before leaving it. The supermarkets had offered, in their own quiet way, one of the small consolations of those years, particularly one establishment whose layout and inventory and general atmosphere were so thoroughly Japanese in character that entering it on difficult evenings had felt something like a brief conversation with the place he had come from. He would walk its aisles on Sunday mornings when the homesickness was at its quietest and most specific, that low, ambient ache for particular things rather than the dramatic longing of the first months, and the familiar labels and familiar smells had done the gentle work that such things do, which is simply to remind you that you exist in a continuous line with who you have been. The Korean grocery stores had become another kind of anchor, smaller, run by individual families, their inventory surprising and their prices considerably less demanding than the Japanese market required, and the owner of the one he visited most regularly had developed a habit of setting certain items aside for him on weekday evenings, a small and unsolicited kindness that had come to matter considerably more than he would have predicted when it began. He had encountered a can green tea early in his stay, American-made, sweet in a way that tea should not be sweet, sold in a tall can with the words printed on it with a cheerful confidence that bore little relation to the thing inside, and had found it, in those first weeks, philosophically unsettling in a way he could not quite articulate even to himself. He had heard it said among the expatriate community he slowly came to know, half joking and half in earnest, that a person's willingness to drink this particular can tea without visible resistance was the truest measure of their readiness for life in that country, more reliable, some claimed, than English fluency or any knowledge of local custom. He had laughed the first time he heard this, and then some months later, on a long drive through unfamiliar landscape with a colleague, had opened one of those tall cans in the passenger seat and drunk it slowly while the countryside moved past outside the window, and had found that it was not, after all, entirely without its uses, something cold and sweet and uncomplicated in the warm middle of an afternoon, requiring nothing of him in return. Many things in that country were like that, he had eventually written, difficult to accept on their own terms at first, and then, with time, not only acceptable but quietly held, the way sounds that once seemed foreign become, over enough exposure, the ordinary sounds of a place you have come to know and carry. The conversations he had had with American women had been among the more illuminating experiences of his years there, not dramatic in their lessons, not sudden, but accumulating slowly the way understanding accumulates when it arrives without an agenda and stays without being asked. A colleague had, when she concluded that she and Shu were not well suited to friendship, explained this to him with a clarity that was gentle precisely because it did not hesitate. She told him quietly that she had found it difficult to build the trust she had been hoping for, and that she was sorry for this, and that she wished him well, and then she had simply moved forward, leaving no unresolved atmosphere, no expectation that he would deduce what had happened from the absence of further contact. He had thought about that conversation many times in the months that followed, not with pain, but with the careful attention you bring to something you want to understand before you file it away, and had come to feel that there was a particular mercy in such directness, a kindness in the willingness to say a plain thing plainly, to spare both people the long confusion of unspoken feeling. He did not believe, in the end, that one way was better, the Japanese way of feeling things quietly across longer stretches of time and relation, the American way of naming them clearly and early, only that each carried its own weight and offered its own gift, and that living alongside both for several years had made him more attentive to the particular costs and particular comforts of each. And so, on this rainy evening in his apartment, the city soft and illuminated beyond his window, Shu turned to the last pages of his notebook and looked at the blank space remaining there, and felt no particular urgency to fill it. He had gone to that country expecting to understand it clearly, the food, the roads, the customs, the particular quality of light over a diner parking lot in the late afternoon, and had come home instead with something more patient and more honest, a sense that a place as large and varied as America could not be understood cleanly, only approached and approached again from different angles at different speeds, the way a very large painting reveals itself differently depending on where you stand and how long you are willing to remain. He thought about the waitresses in the slow middle of afternoons, the old cars rolling along wide roads going somewhere he had never been, the two lanes of traffic merging in that quiet and perfect rhythm without anyone telling them how, the grocery store owner who set things aside for him on Thursdays without being asked. He thought about the afternoon of tea on the long drive, the Five Guys bag overflowing on the table in all its reckless generosity, the dark of the movie theater where everyone laughed together at the same moment and no one seemed to feel this required any particular permission. He set the notebook aside and picked up his cup of tea, Japanese tea, properly made, properly plain, still faintly warm in the late hour, and listened to the rain settling into the city outside his window, familiar and very near, the sound of a place he had always been from even when he was very far away from it. There was, he found himself thinking in the comfortable dimness of the room, something that every long journey left behind in a person, a kind of doubled vision, a way of seeing the known place through the accumulated experience of the unknown one, so that ordinary things became briefly extraordinary again, briefly visible again after the long sleep of familiarity. The rain was just rain, and the city was just the city, and the cup in his hands was just a cup, and yet he held all of it with a particular attentiveness, the attentiveness of someone who has been away long enough to forget the exact weight of home, and has come back and remembered, and who understands now that this remembering is its own form of arrival. And that, perhaps, was the deepest thing those years had given him, not the knowledge of another country, but a renewed and more deliberate knowledge of this one, seen now with the quiet gratitude of a traveler who has come a long way home, and who is glad, in the small hours of a rainy evening, to simply be here, with his cup and his notebook and the sound of the city in the rain. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade softly, the way a candle dims when you carry it into another room. There is no hurry here. If you would like, take a slow breath in now, and let it go without effort, without thinking about where it goes. Your body knows how to rest. The night holds you, the darkness is gentle, and there is nothing at all that needs your attention. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, a place where the light falls low and unhurried, where voices are soft and the air carries the faint warmth of something ordinary and kind. Simply let yourself settle a little deeper, and when you are ready, we will begin. Someone who has lived abroad will sometimes speak of the experience differently than someone who has only visited, and there is a particular kind of quiet knowing that settles into a person who has spent real months, real seasons, in another country. She had gone to America with all the usual images in her mind, the wide roads, the enormous houses, the sense of openness and light that seemed to spill from every film she had ever watched. What she had not expected was how slowly those images would rearrange themselves, day by quiet day, into something more layered and more human. She would later recall that it began, of all places, in the supermarket. Nothing could quite prepare someone who had grown up in Japan for the first morning in an American supermarket, not the size alone, which was enormous, but the specific way the size felt, the long cool aisles reaching off into distance, the sense that one could wander for an entire afternoon and still not find the far edge of it. She remembered standing in the produce section, staring at a clear plastic box the size of a small pillow, filled entirely with baby spinach leaves, and feeling a particular kind of bewilderment she could not quite name. In Japan, spinach, harenso, as it is known there, comes in small, careful bundles, tied with a paper band, already blanched and ready for dressing with sesame and soy, a quiet vegetable with quiet manners. In America, the spinach came in these enormous translucent containers, raw and voluminous, stacked high in their refrigerated rows, and people would tuck 2 or 3 boxes under their arms without a second thought, carrying them home to fold into salads and sauté pans in great generous handfuls. She bought 1 box, and then another, and by the 3rd week she was buying them the way everyone else did, without ceremony, without surprise. That was, she came to understand, how adaptation worked, not through grand moments of decision, but through small surrenders to practicality, 1 box of spinach at a time. The supermarkets themselves became a kind of geography she learned to navigate over months, each one with its own personality and its own unspoken social meaning. There was the large chain store that felt warm and slightly chaotic, where the prices were reasonable and the floors were wide, and where she would spend an hour on Sunday mornings filling her cart with enough food to last the entire week. There was the other store, the one with wooden floors and carefully arranged displays of artisanal cheese and imported olive oils, where she would go occasionally, on days when she wanted to feel somewhere beautiful, even if it meant spending twice as much for a handful of mushrooms. And then there were the Asian grocery stores, the ones that had been her unexpected lifeline in that first bewildering year. She had not known, before she went, that she would feel such a specific and almost physical relief the first time she walked into one, the particular smell of dried kelp and sesame oil, the rows of tofu in their water-filled containers, the instant noodles with their familiar bright packaging, all of it arranged along aisles that felt, somehow, like a quiet conversation with home. A friend had told her about a large Korean-run market with wide aisles and an entire section devoted to Japanese ingredients, and she had driven there on a Saturday, half expecting disappointment, and had instead found herself standing in the middle of the aisle with something very close to gratitude. The soy sauce was there, and the miso paste in its tubs, and the natto in its small styrofoam cases, and the pickled plums, and the sesame crackers, everything that had seemed so unremarkable in Japan and had become, in its absence, something close to precious. She had filled 2 bags and carried them home carefully, and that evening had made a simple meal of rice and miso soup, and felt, for the first time in weeks, entirely herself. Food, she was learning, was a kind of anchor, and when the anchor shifts, you notice how deep the water is. There were other small things she had not anticipated, the texture of daily life that no guidebook thinks to mention. The eggs, for instance. In Japan, eggs are sold with the quiet confidence of something carefully handled, washed in a specific way, refrigerated from the moment of laying, safe to eat raw in a bowl of warm rice with a little soy sauce, a simple pleasure taken entirely for granted. In America, she learned through a gentle warning from a colleague who noticed the expression on her face that the eggs were different, that the handling process was different, that the unspoken social contract around eggs was different, and that certain simple pleasures she had relied upon would need to be reimagined. She learned to open every carton before buying, to check each egg for cracks, to hold each one lightly before placing it in the cart, a small ritual of care that felt excessive at first and then, gradually, simply necessary. There were other discoveries of this kind, including the unfamiliar botanical sweetness that sometimes drifted through certain neighborhoods on summer evenings, something herbal and slightly heady that turned out to be perfectly legal in those particular states and entirely surprising to anyone who had grown up in Japan, and yet another small adjustment to absorb. The distances were something else entirely. She remembered a conversation with a colleague from Texas who mentioned that his parents lived 11 hours away by car, and said it in the way one might mention that a relative lives in the next prefecture, with mild inconvenience but no particular drama. 11 hours, she had thought, was the distance from one end of Japan to the other, and this man drove it on holidays as a matter of course, loading the car on a Friday evening and arriving sometime deep into Saturday with no sense of having done anything remarkable. The roads themselves seemed to accommodate this philosophy of vast distance, wide and straight and continuous, stretching ahead into a horizon that felt almost theatrical in its flatness, for lanes in each direction and then more lanes beyond that. A friend of hers once described watching, early one morning on the highway, a peculiar machine making its slow way along the road, a large vehicle that straddled the concrete barriers between lanes and, as it moved forward, lifted each heavy block and set it down a lane over, reshaping the road itself. The arrangement would change, her friend explained, morning and evening, to accommodate the direction of traffic flow, more lanes going into the city at dawn, more going out at dusk, and this mechanical creature rearranged the infrastructure of the road as casually as one might push furniture across a room. She had heard this story and felt the particular kind of delight that comes from learning something completely outside your previous understanding of how the world can work. America, she was discovering, had a certain fondness for large solutions to large problems, an enthusiasm for scale that could be both genuinely impressive and, at times, quietly exhausting. The social texture of the place took longer to understand than the physical landscape. There was the elevator, for instance, a small enclosed space that in Japan is navigated in respectful silence, eyes forward, with a brief acknowledgement of shared humanity and then nothing more, because more would feel like an intrusion. In America, she noticed, strangers in elevators would often speak, would make some small observation about the weather or the building or the time of day, and there was a kind of gentle expectation in the air that she was a participant in this exchange, whether she had chosen to be or not. It took her months to understand that this was not intrusiveness but a different kind of consideration, the assumption that all people sharing a small space are, for that moment, briefly acquainted, and that silence in such a context is what requires the explanation. She came to find it charming, eventually, though at first it had unsettled her, the way a language you are still learning can unsettle you, or not because you cannot understand the words, but because the rhythm of the thing is unfamiliar. The driving culture had its own unspoken agreements, and some of them surprised her with their quiet civility. There was a stretch of road near her apartment where two lanes merged into one, and she had expected the familiar tense jostling she sometimes encountered elsewhere, each driver looking ahead and accelerating slightly, hoping to win the narrowing space. Instead, she watched as the cars took turns, one from each lane, alternating with a patience and regularity that looked almost choreographed, no sign posted, no instruction given, simply a local understanding that had settled into habit. It was, she came to feel, one of the most quietly lovely things she witnessed in all her time there, this small, unofficial kindness that drivers extended to one another without acknowledgement or thanks, as though it had simply always been the way things were done. The work culture was something that took the longest to feel natural, because the gap between what she had expected and what she found was wide in ways she had not anticipated, not worse, exactly, but different in texture, different in what it asked of you. Jobs came and went with a swiftness that would have felt alarming in Japan, but that here seemed to carry less emotional weight, as though employment were a lighter thing, a coat you put on for a season and then left on a hook when the weather changed. People took days off without elaborate justification, would call in ill and simply be ill, without the particular social anxiety she had sometimes felt at home about the cost of absence. There was, she observed, a different relationship to rest, as though rest were something a person was entitled to as a matter of fact, rather than something that had to be earned through visible exhaustion and then quietly apologized for. She had thought about this a great deal during her last winter there, sitting at a small table by a window that overlooked a street where the trees were bare and the morning sky was a pale and even gray. She had thought about what it meant that different countries had arranged such similar human needs, the need for food, for rest, for belonging, for the comfort of familiar things, into such very different daily shapes. The people she met in America were not, in the end, so different from the people she had known at home. They had the same small preoccupations, the same quiet hopes, the same tendency to speak of their lives in terms of what they had imagined and what they had found instead. A colleague had once mentioned, in passing, that she had grown up in a very small town where the nearest city was a long drive away, and had spent her childhood reading novels and dreaming of distant places, and something in that image felt entirely familiar, the way certain human experiences are familiar across any geography. She went home eventually, as people do, carrying back whatever is light enough to carry, not the physical things, which are heavy, but the smaller accumulations, a new ease with wide roads, a changed way of making a salad, the instinct to say something warm and small to a stranger in an elevator. She carried back, too, a kind of recalibrated wonder about the country she had come from, a fresh sense of what was ordinary and what was remarkable, visible now only through the contrast of somewhere else. Japan, seen from the distance of years and miles, had taken on a particular quality, the quiet of the trains, the care in the packaging, the small rituals around food and greeting and seasonal change, that she had never quite been able to see clearly from the inside. America had given her that, and she came to think of it as perhaps the most unexpected gift of the whole experience, not any particular thing she had seen or done, but a new way of looking at the place she had always loved. There are stories, she sometimes thought, that can only be understood from the inside, lived rather than read, accumulated in small ordinary moments rather than explained all at once. No photograph, no guidebook, no film quite captures the specific weight of a box of spinach in your arms in a foreign supermarket, the small vertigo of encountering something so ordinary arranged in a way that is entirely new to you. No account quite conveys the particular relief of finding, in an unfamiliar city, a jar of miso paste on a shelf, and understanding that the familiar can travel with you even when you cannot see it. And no summary holds the quality of those elevator conversations, those brief, unlikely exchanges with strangers who assumed you were worth speaking to, simply because you were there. She kept a small notebook during those years, not a diary exactly, more a collection of observations, the kind you make when everything around you is slightly tilted from familiar and your attention sharpens in compensation. In it she had written about the spinach, and the eggs, and the machine that rearranged the road, and the cars that merged without argument, and the colleagues who took their rest without apology. She had written about the Asian grocery store and the particular smell of it, and about how she had once stood in the middle of the soy sauce aisle with her eyes closed for a moment, just breathing. Reading it back now, years later, she found that what surprised her most was not the strangeness of what she had recorded, but how tenderly she had written about it, with a patience and a warmth she had not known, at the time, that she possessed. Perhaps that is what living somewhere slowly teaches you, and not the kind of knowing that comes from a week of travel and photographs, but the kind that accumulates over seasons, in the texture of daily life, in small adjustments and quiet surrenders and unexpected moments of recognition. She had set out with an image of a country, wide and bright and cinematic, and found, instead, something more modest and more interesting, a place where people managed great distances with patience, extended small courtesies to strangers in elevators and on merging lanes, and kept their spinach in clear boxes stacked in the cold. And that place, imperfect and generous and endlessly surprising, had made a small room for itself inside her, the way any place does when you have lived there long enough to know where the light falls in the morning. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, in the memory of wide roads and the smell of sesame oil found far from home, and the slow, warm understanding that the world is larger and softer than any single image we carry of it. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet mystery settling gently into the dark like dust after a long, still afternoon. There is no need to hold on to any of it. You can simply let it go, the way a breath releases without effort, without thought. Rest here for just a moment if you like. There is no rush, no place you need to be, nothing waiting for your attention. Our next story takes us to a quieter setting, somewhere with soft light and the small, unhurried sounds of an ordinary evening. But before we arrive, feel the weight of your body, the warmth wherever you are resting, and let yourself settle just a little deeper. Everything is calm. Everything is slow. Somewhere in the slow hours of the night, when the sounds outside have grown faint and the room has settled into its own stillness, there is a story worth telling about sweetness, and what we have made of it. It is, on the surface, a small story, the kind that arrives in the news for a few days and then passes, but beneath the surface it touches something older and more interesting, something about the quiet ways our world changes while we are not especially looking. Like many things that matter in a gentle way, it begins with something so familiar that most of us have never once thought to question it, a single ingredient in a recipe that has remained mostly secret for well over 100 years. In the spring of a recent year, an announcement moved out from Washington and spread through news channels and online communities and ordinary conversations in homes and offices across 2 countries, landing with different weights in different places. The announcement involved a drink that has been poured into glasses and bottles and cans in nearly every country in the world for longer than most people's grandparents can remember, that dark and softly fizzing liquid whose name you already know. Specifically, the question was about the sweetener used to make the American version of that drink, and whether it should change from something derived from corn to something derived from sugarcane, and what such a change would mean for all the people whose livelihoods were woven into each. For several decades, the American version had been made not with cane sugar, as it had been in its earliest years, but with a syrup processed from corn, pale and thick, the kind that had worked its way into hundreds of other food products during the same period, driven by the quiet arithmetic of abundance. Corn was plentiful in the flat middle of the continent, and corn syrup was less expensive, and so the change had happened gradually and without fanfare, becoming so established that most people had simply taken it as the natural condition of the thing, the way things had always been. Generations of people had grown up drinking this version and had never known another, had come to understand its particular sweetness as the correct one, the familiar one, the taste that meant summer or childhood or an afternoon somewhere long ago that they could not quite name anymore. When the announcement suggested that this might change, the response was not simple and not quiet. The corn industry of America, which had built a significant portion of its processing capacity around the production of this syrup, responded with real alarm, noting that a reversal would affect thousands of jobs in farming communities across the middle of the country. Industry associations issued statements with precise language about the economic consequences, about farming families whose income would fall, and about the small towns where processing facilities were often the largest employer for many miles in any direction. There was also, running beneath the alarm and the economics, a quieter question that had been circulating for some time, which was whether the ingredient being proposed for replacement was actually a particularly good one, from the point of view of the people who consumed it every day. For years there had been a conversation among those who study nutrition about the particular type of corn syrup most commonly used as a sweetener, whether the body receives it differently than it receives ordinary sugar, whether it interferes in some way with the signals that tell a person they have had enough. This conversation had never produced a clean resolution, as conversations about nutrition rarely do, but it had persisted, and in the context of this announcement it returned with renewed attention, giving some observers a reason to view the proposed change as something other than purely political. In Japan, the story was read with a particular kind of interest, in the online communities where people follow the news of other countries the way one might follow the lives of characters in a long and complicated novel, at a comfortable remove but with genuine investment. People discuss the announcement in the associative, meandering way of those who are genuinely curious about a question without needing to arrive at any particular conclusion, moving between the factual and the speculative and the personal with an ease that the medium allows. One theme that returned more than once in these conversations was the question of taste, specifically the question of whether the drink made with cane sugar tasted different from the version made with corn syrup, and the answer most people offered was yes, gently and distinctly yes. The Mexican version of the drink had long been made with cane sugar, and those who had managed to taste it, whether on a trip or through specialty importers who sold it in glass bottles, described it with a warmth that was almost nostalgic even for something they had not grown up drinking. They noted that it seemed slightly rounder in its sweetness, less sharp at the edges, fuller somehow on the tongue, as though the flavor had been given more room to settle into itself before it was finished. Someone mentioned that the glass bottle itself played a role, that drinking from glass carried a different quality than drinking from aluminum or plastic, and this small observation opened into a larger one about how much of what we call taste is actually composed of other things entirely: the vessel, the temperature, the hour of the day, the company we happen to be keeping. This is something that anyone who has paid careful attention to food and drink already understands, that the experience of tasting is not a simple biological event but a composition of many things happening at once: the sensation in the mouth, yes, but also the memory of the first time, and the associations that have accumulated since, and the particular circumstances of the current moment. A drink that is cold on a very warm afternoon is not the same drink on a cool morning in a quiet room, even if the liquid in the glass is chemically identical. A recipe made with one sweetener carries a different history. In America, there were people who remembered the older version, who could describe with some precision the way the drink had tasted when they were children, before the formula was adjusted, and who carried with them a kind of mild and long-held sense that something had been quietly exchanged without anyone asking their opinion. Others could detect no difference and found the entire conversation gently baffling, the kind of nostalgic attachment that comes to surround almost any change and should perhaps not always be trusted as a reliable guide to what was actually better. The truth was, as it usually is in such matters, somewhere in the middle, between the thing remembered and the thing imagined, residing in that soft territory where memory and preference can no longer be clearly separated. In the south of the United States, where the warm climate and particular soil allow sugarcane to grow in long flat fields that stretch toward the horizon, farming communities received the news of the announcement with something closer to cautious hope. The thought that demand for cane sugar might increase, that their crop might find a larger market, that the years of working in the shadow of the corn industry might give way to a different arrangement, was not something anyone stated with confidence, but it was present in the conversations, quietly named and quietly held. One might imagine a kitchen in the evening in those farming regions, similar in its essentials to a kitchen in the Corn Belt many hundreds of miles to the north, a table cleared after dinner, someone standing by the counter with a glass of something cold, the same patient arithmetic running through the same patient mind about what next year might look like. There was also, as there almost always is with matters of American agriculture and trade, a dimension to the story that extended beyond the country itself, into the web of international arrangements and tariffs and bilateral negotiations that make the sourcing of any commodity a matter of diplomatic concern as much as an agricultural one. Some of the Japanese commenters recognized this with a kind of wry familiarity, noting that their own country had its own version of these arrangements, that the sugarcane grown in Okinawa was supported by government purchase programs paying considerably more than the market would otherwise offer, a subsidy with its critics and defenders and its own long history of political weight. The recognition of a parallel, finding in a foreign story a reflection of something close to home, is one of the quiet satisfactions of following the world beyond one's own borders. There was a detail in the story that several people found worth noting, offered without judgment but with a certain mild appreciation for its irony, which was that the man who had made the announcement drank the diet version of the drink, the one sweetened artificially, and so the change he was describing would not alter the thing he himself consumed. This was received as a piece of information about the nature of advocacy and authority, set aside without any particular conclusion being drawn from it, filed as one of those observations that says something about the distance between those who make decisions and those who live with them. The question of whether one can genuinely advocate for something one has no direct stake in is an old one, and it divides people in ways that say something about their broader understanding of human motivation, whether care can extend outward beyond direct experience, or whether it is always, in some quiet way, rooted in what touches the self. Both positions contain something true, and both leave something out, and so the question continues as such questions tend to do. The online discussion drifted, as these discussions always do, into adjacent territory, into the chemistry of sweeteners and the historical origins of corn syrup and the particular series of trade decisions that had made the substitution economically attractive in the first place. Someone traced the widespread use of the corn-derived sweetener back to changes in sugar import policy several decades ago, to a time when the availability of cane sugar from certain nearby countries was disrupted, and so a substitute had been found and had, over years, simply become the standard. This is how many things that seem natural come to be, through the accumulation of responses to circumstances that are themselves forgotten, each practical step making the next one slightly more natural, until the arrangement seems as though it could not have been otherwise. Someone mentioned that the popcorn sold in movie theaters had followed a similar path, becoming a fixture of the cinema not because it was the most natural accompaniment but because it was inexpensive and drew people in with its smell and had gradually become part of what going to the movies meant. Corn, one might observe in passing, has been woven into the fabric of American life in ways that go far deeper than any single product or policy decision, cultivated for thousands of years by the people who inhabited the continent before anyone else arrived, and then industrialized and refined into fuel and starch and sweetener and packaging in the centuries since. It is present in almost everything, in ways that most people do not know and would not immediately guess, and yet it is rarely the thing anyone is specifically thinking about when they reach for whatever they are about to eat or drink. There is something quietly remarkable in that, the way a thing can be so thoroughly embedded in the structure of daily life that it becomes entirely invisible, present at every meal without ever quite arriving at the table. The secret formula of the drink at the center of all this was something else that came up briefly in the conversations, the fact that only a very small number of people in the entire world knew the complete recipe, that it was kept with considerable care and had never been published, and that the sweetener being debated was only one component of a composition that remained, in most of its parts, genuinely unknown to the hundreds of millions of people who drank it every day. There is something that the imagination finds quietly compelling about that detail, a formula consumed so widely and so casually, by people who have no idea what they are actually tasting, a small and carefully preserved mystery at the center of something perfectly ordinary. Perhaps that is part of what makes certain familiar things feel inexhaustible, that they contain some element that resists being fully known, and so they never become entirely understood, and the encounter with them remains always, in some barely perceptible way, slightly new. The night has deepened while this story has been telling itself, and the world of trade announcements and industry statements and late-night comment threads has grown quiet in the way that all things grow quiet at this hour, their urgency softening into the general stillness. The corn farmers in the middle of the continent have gone to rest in their houses, and the sugarcane farmers in the south have gone to rest in theirs, and the bottling plants run on through the small hours on whatever specification they have been given, unconcerned with the conversation. And in Japan, the commenters have closed their browsers and set their phones on whatever surface is nearest, and the windows of the apartment buildings have gone dark one by one, and the story has passed into the quiet category of things that were interesting to consider and are now at rest. What lingers, when the argument has settled into silence, is something simpler and less debatable, the memory of a taste, the particular quality of a sweetness that has meant something specific to each person who has come to know it. A cold drink shared with someone on a warm afternoon, with the sound of summer somewhere nearby, children's voices carrying from a distance, has become part of the flavor itself, inseparable from the chemistry, stored not in any formula but in the way certain afternoons stay with us long after they have ended. No announcement from any capital, no adjustment to any recipe, can reach into that memory and alter it, because it was made in a moment that is now finished, sealed there along with everything else that was true that afternoon. The world changes its recipes from time to time, and the body adjusts, and eventually the new version becomes the familiar one, and the old one becomes the province of those who were present for it, held gently in the part of memory that keeps the small things. This is not quite a loss, though it sometimes carries the feeling of one. It is more like the ordinary passage of time, which revises everything slowly and without particular malice, one quiet substitution at a time, the world continuing its long and patient work of becoming something slightly different than it was. What remains, through all of it, is the simple capacity to taste at all, to sit with something cold and still and find in it some small measure of pleasure, whatever the formula, whatever the announcement, whatever the particular sweetener that has been agreed upon somewhere far away. And that, perhaps, is where this story finds its resting place tonight, not in any resolution, but in the quiet recognition that the world continues its slow negotiations, and sweetness is sweetness in the end, wherever it comes from, and the night, in any case, makes everything a little simpler than it seemed in the afternoon. And so, we have come to the end of tonight's stories. The voices are quiet now. The last thread of each tale has been set down gently, like a letter folded and placed on a nightstand.